In the vast annals of Westeros, few names command such reverence and mystery as Jon Snow, the bastard who became a king, the dead man who returned to life, the lover who chose duty above all else. Born Aegon Targaryen beneath the shadow of Robert's rebellion, his true heritage remained hidden for decades behind the honor of Eddard Stark. From the bastard's table at Winterfell to the throne room of the Red Keep, his journey would reshape the Seven Kingdoms forever. This is the tale of ice and fire made flesh, of a man who saved the world through sacrifice, love, and the hardest choices imaginable. The year was 283. After the conquest, when the realm bled in rebellion against the Mad King. In the Red Mountains of Dorne, where ancient stones guard forgotten secrets, stood the Tower of Joy. Within its weathered walls lay a dying woman and the truth that would shake the foundations of Westeros. Lyanna Stark, beloved sister to Eddard of Winterfell, drew her final breaths not as Robert Baratheon's stolen bride, but as the willing wife of Prince Rhaegar Targaryen. The Silver Prince, with his harp and melancholy songs, had won her heart, not stolen her by force as the songs would claim. 3 Kingsguard knights stood vigil outside her chamber, the finest swords in the Seven Kingdoms, bound by sacred oaths to protect their prince's bloodline. Lord Commander Gerald Hightower, Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning, and Oswell Went had remained at their posts even as King's Landing fell and their king burned in dragonfire. When Eddard Stark arrived with 6 companions, seeking his sister's fate, steel rang against steel in the shadow of ancient Dornish peaks. Only Ned and Howland Reed survived that final melee, stepping over the bodies of legends to reach the tower's heart. The sight that greeted them within defied every song and story that would follow. Lyanna lay in a bed of blood, having just given birth to Rhaegar's son. No rape, no abduction. Only love that had sparked a war and claimed thousands of lives. With her dying breath, she extracted a promise from her brother that would haunt him for 17 years. "The child must live," she whispered, "and his heritage must remain hidden." Robert Baratheon's warhammer had already claimed Rhaegar's life at the Trident, and the new king's hatred for all things Targaryen burned as hot as wildfire. Aerys's grandchildren, little Rhaenys and baby Aegon, had already been butchered during the sack of King's Landing, their heads dashed against walls by the mountain that rides. Eddard Stark faced an impossible choice between honor and love, between his sacred oath to Robert and his promise to his dying sister. The man who had built his reputation on unwavering honesty chose to become the realm's most successful liar. He would claim this purple-eyed infant as his own bastard son, born of a knight's passion during the war. The stain on his honor would protect the child's life, ensuring that Robert's hatred would never fall upon this innocent boy. Ned wrapped the babe in Stark colors and began the long journey north to Winterfell, carrying with him a secret that could topple kingdoms. The name he chose carried both love and concealment in equal measure. Jon, after Jon Arryn, the man who had raised Ned like a father in the Eyrie and stood as Robert's steadfast hand. Snow, the bastard surname, granted to acknowledged natural children born in the north. The boy's true name, Aegon, died with Lyanna in that Dornish tower, buried beneath layers of necessary deception. Thus began the greatest masquerade in Westerosi history, transforming a prince of the blood into a bastard boy whose very existence served as a dagger to his supposed father's reputation. For 17 years, Jon Snow grew in the halls of Winterfell, never knowing that royal blood flowed through his veins. The castle that had sheltered Stark children for thousands of years became his prison and his sanctuary, a place where he belonged, yet never quite fit. The massive walls of gray stone witnessed his daily struggles with identity, watching as he trained with wooden swords, alongside true-born children who could never understand his burden. Every feast, every gathering, every moment of family joy carried with it the reminder of what he could never truly be. Eddard treated his supposed bastard son with the same care and attention he showed his true-born children, a kindness that both protected Jon and created its own complications. Robb Stark became his closest companion and fiercest rival, the two boys inseparable despite the chasm of legitimacy that divided them. They trained together in the castle yard under Ser Rodrik Cassell's watchful eye, their wooden swords clacking in rhythm as they learned the ancient dances of war. Robb possessed the easy confidence of someone born to rule, while Jon fought with the desperate intensity of someone who had to prove his worth every single day. The other Stark children each formed their own bonds with their supposed half-brother, relationships that would endure through years of separation and war. Brandon, youngest of the boys, looked up to Jon with the hero worship that small children reserve for older siblings who show them kindness. Little Rickon followed Jon around the castle like a shadow, his wild, Stark blood recognizing something familiar in the bastard's quiet strength. Jon's relationship with his supposed sisters proved more complex, shaped by the expectations and prejudices of their world. Sansa Stark, golden-haired and beautiful, embodied everything that Catelyn Tully had brought to Winterfell from the south. She dreamed of knights and courtly love, of a world where birth and blood determined worth and station. To her, Jon represented everything unseemly about her father's past, a living reminder that even the most honorable men could fall prey to base desires. Her coldness toward him mirrored her mother's, though it lacked the bitter edge that years of resentment had given Catelyn's treatment of the boy. Arya Stark proved to be Jon's truest ally among his siblings, the wild wolf girl who understood what it meant to exist outside society's expectations. She possessed her father's long face and gray eyes, along with a spirit that rebelled against every attempt to force her into a proper lady's mold. In Jon, she found a kindred spirit, someone else who didn't quite fit the role that birth had assigned him. They would spend hours together in the castle yard, Jon teaching her the basics of swordplay while she regaled him with tales of her adventures exploring Winterfell's hidden passages. The shadow that fell across Jon's childhood had a name and a face, though he could never have imagined the depth of her pain. Catelyn Stark, born a Tully of Riverrun, had married Eddard in the aftermath of Robert's rebellion, a political union that had blossomed into genuine love. She had expected to face the usual challenges of a lord's wife, managing his household and bearing his children, strengthening the bonds between noble houses through marriage and alliance. What she had not expected was to share her home with the living proof of her husband's supposed infidelity, a daily reminder that even the most honorable man in Westeros was still just a man. Her treatment of Jon walked a careful line between cruelty and indifference. She never struck him or openly berated him, for to do so would reflect poorly on her lord husband's bastard. Instead, she employed the subtle weapons available to a great lady, ensuring that Jon understood his place through 1,000 small slights and careful exclusions. He would not sit at the high table when important guests visited Winterfell, lest his presence offend those who valued legitimacy above all else. He would receive his father's cast-offs rather than clothes cut specifically for him, a constant reminder that he existed on the margins of the family that sheltered him. The most painful moments came during formal occasions, when the difference between Jon's status and that of his supposed siblings became impossible to ignore. Wedding celebrations, name day feasts, visits from neighboring lords, all served to highlight the invisible barriers that separated bastards from their true-born kin. Jon learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when his presence was unwelcome, developing an instinct for self-preservation that would serve him well in the years to come. He became expert at finding excuses to absent himself from gatherings where his bastard birth might cause embarrassment, protecting both himself and the family that had given him shelter. Yet for all the pain that his illegitimate status caused him, Jon never lacked for love or care within Winterfell's walls. Eddard ensured that he received the same education as his true-born sons, learning letters and numbers from Maester Luwin, alongside lessons in history, heraldry, and the proper conduct expected of a noble-born child. The kindly Maester treated Jon no differently than he did Robb or Bran, recognizing in the quiet boy a quick mind and an eagerness to learn that would serve him well regardless of his birth circumstances. Ser Rodrik Cassell, Winterfell's master-at-arms, proved equally generous in his training of the Stark children. His lessons in swordplay, horsemanship, and the warrior's arts made no distinction between bastard and trueborn, focusing instead on each child's individual strengths and weaknesses. Under his patient instruction, Jon learned to channel his anger and frustration into martial prowess, developing skills that would one day save his life and the lives of those he swore to protect. The practice yard became his sanctuary, a place where worth was measured in skill and courage, rather than the circumstances of birth. The servants and small folk of Winterfell showed Jon a kindness that the highborn often withheld, recognizing in him the same quiet dignity that marked his supposed father. Old Nan would tell him the same stories she shared with the other children, tales of the long night and the last hero, of Brandon the Builder and the kings of winter who had ruled the north for thousands of years. These stories planted seeds in young Jon's mind, dreams of heroism and purpose that would one day drive him to greatness. The castle's grooms taught him to care for horses with the same patience they showed the true-born Starks, while the kitchen staff ensured he never went hungry despite the complex protocols that governed bastard children's treatment. The reality of Castle Black struck Jon Snow like a blow to the chest, shattering every romantic notion he had harbored about the Night's Watch during his years at Winterfell. The ancient fortress squatted on the wall's southern face like a collection of wounds carved into black stone, its towers crumbling and its halls echoing with the bitter laughter of broken men. Where Jon had expected to find noble knights sworn to defend the realm from ancient evils, he instead discovered murderers, rapists, thieves, and cowards who had chosen the Black to escape justice or starvation. The legendary brotherhood of heroes existed only in songs and stories, replaced by this grim reality of outcasts and criminals seeking refuge from their past sins. The castle itself reflected the decay that had infected the Night's Watch over centuries of decline. Once proud halls now leaked cold through gaps in ancient mortar, their hearth fires struggling against the perpetual chill that seeped down from the wall's icy heights. The dining hall reeked of unwashed bodies and rotten meat, its long tables scarred by countless knives and stained with wine and blood in equal measure. Rats scurried through corridors that had once echoed with the footsteps of heroes, while the wind whistled through broken windows that no one bothered to repair. This was no sanctuary of honor, but a dumping ground for the realm's unwanted, a place where desperate men came to die slowly rather than quickly. Tyrion Lannister had accompanied them to the wall, the dwarf's curiosity about the Great Barrier overriding any concerns about the discomfort such a journey might entail. His presence proved both blessing and curse for Jon, offering intellectual stimulation and bitter wisdom while also serving as a constant reminder of the world of privilege he had left behind. The imp possessed a razor-sharp mind and a tongue to match, capable of cutting through pretense and self-deception with surgical precision. He observed the Night's Watch with the detached interest of a scholar studying insects, noting their weaknesses and hypocrisies with an accuracy that made Jon squirm. The other recruits viewed Jon with suspicion and resentment from his first day among them, recognizing immediately that he possessed advantages they could never hope to match. His fine clothes, his castle-forged sword, his proper speech, and noble bearing all marked him as different from the desperate rabble that typically sought the Watch's protection. They saw in him everything they despised about the highborn world that had cast them aside, a pampered lordling playing at being a sworn brother, while remaining utterly ignorant of the hunger and desperation that had driven them to take the Black. Their resentment manifested in countless small cruelties, from accidentally bumping into him during meals to ensuring he received the worst assignments during training. Sir Alliser Thorne embodied everything wrong with the Night's Watch's current state. A bitter knight whose service had curdled into cruelty over long years of disappointment and neglect. The Master-at-Arms had fought for House Targaryen during Robert's Rebellion, earning exile to the Wall when the wrong side lost and the victors sought to punish their enemies. His defeat at the Trident had transformed a proud knight into a vindictive teacher who delighted in humiliating recruits, particularly those who reminded him of the nobility that had cast him aside. In Jon Snow, he saw the perfect target for his accumulated rage, a bastard who dared to carry himself like a true-born lord despite lacking any legal claim to such status. Thorne's training methods bordered on sadistic, designed to break spirits rather than forge warriors. He would pit Jon against multiple opponents simultaneously, then berate him for using techniques learned from Winterfell's master-at-arms, rather than adapting to the crude brawling style that most Watch recruits employed. When Jon's superior training allowed him to defeat other recruits with ease, Thorne accused him of showing off and assigned him extra duties as punishment. The master-at-arms seemed to take particular pleasure in highlighting the differences between Jon's privileged upbringing and the harsh realities that had shaped his fellow recruits, using every opportunity to remind the bastard that his noble blood meant nothing beyond the wall. The other recruits initially offered Jon no sympathy in his struggles with Thorne, viewing his humiliation as just punishment for his apparent arrogance. Gren, a slow-witted but strong young man from the Reach, had never forgiven Jon for defeating him so easily during their first sparring session. Pypar, called Pip by his friends, possessed a quick wit and quicker tongue that he used to mock Jon's noble pretensions at every opportunity. Rast, a cruel boy who had fled King's Landing after allegedly raping a steward's daughter, delighted in tormenting anyone he perceived as weak or different. Even Halder, generally considered one of the more decent recruits, maintained a careful distance from the bastard who seemed to invite Thorne's particular attention. Tyrion Lannister observed these dynamics with the keen eye of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating the treacherous waters of court politics, recognizing patterns of behavior that Jon remained too naive to understand. The dwarf had experienced his own share of mockery and exclusion, understanding better than most how cruelty could manifest in supposedly civilized settings. His conversations with Jon during those early days served as both education and therapy, offering perspectives that the young bastard desperately needed to survive his new environment. Tyrion's wisdom cut through Jon's confusion and self-pity, revealing truths about human nature that no maester's lessons had ever covered. The breakthrough in Jon's relationships with his fellow recruits came through Tyrion's blunt counsel about the realities of his situation. The dwarf pointed out that Jon's superior training and noble upbringing had given him unfair advantages over boys who had learned to fight in alleyways and taverns, defending themselves against cutthroats and sellswords, rather than training with master-at-arms in castle yards. His repeated defeats of his fellow recruits had served only to highlight their inadequacies while demonstrating his own superiority, creating resentment where he might have built friendship. Tyrion suggested that Jon's real strength lay not in his sword arm, but in his ability to teach others, sharing the knowledge he had gained rather than using it to humiliate those less fortunate. This revelation transformed Jon's approach to training and his relationships with his fellow brothers in black. Instead of dominating every sparring session, he began offering guidance and instruction to those who struggled with basic techniques. He showed Gren how to better balance his considerable strength with proper footwork, helping the larger boy become a more effective fighter rather than simply overpowering him with superior skill. Pip benefited from lessons in defensive techniques that compensated for his smaller stature, while Halder learned to use his natural agility to better advantage. Even Rast, for all his cruelty, proved receptive to instruction that might improve his chances of survival. The change in Jon's approach gradually shifted the dynamics within their training group, earning him grudging respect from recruits who had previously viewed him with suspicion and resentment. They began to see him not as a privileged lordling slumming among his inferiors, but as a fellow outcast who happened to possess useful knowledge. His willingness to share rather than hoard his advantages demonstrated a generosity of spirit that few had expected from someone of noble birth. These small acts of kindness and instruction laid the foundation for friendships that would endure through years of hardship and danger. Sir Alistair Thorne viewed this development with obvious displeasure, recognizing that Jon's growing popularity among the recruits undermined his own authority and control. The master-at-arms had built his power on division and competition, encouraging recruits to turn against each other rather than forming bonds that might challenge his dominance. Jon's emergence as an informal leader and teacher threatened this carefully maintained balance, creating unity where Thorne preferred discord. His response was to increase the pressure on Jon, assigning him increasingly difficult and dangerous tasks while continuing to berate him for every perceived failure or shortcoming. The training regimen at Castle Black reflected the Watch's decline from its legendary past, focusing on basic survival skills rather than the martial prowess that songs claimed the Black brothers once possessed. Recruits learned to fight with whatever weapons they could find, from rusted swords to farm tools pressed into service as makeshift weapons. They practiced archery with bows that had seen better decades, their arrows often missing their targets by yards rather than inches. The emphasis fell on endurance rather than skill, preparing men to survive in the harsh conditions beyond the wall rather than to face supernatural threats that most considered mere legend. Jon's education in the realities of Night's Watch service extended beyond the training yard into every aspect of daily life at Castle Black. He learned to sleep in dormitories filled with snoring, farting men whose personal hygiene left much to be desired. Discovering that privacy was a luxury reserved for officers and the dead. Meals consisted of salt, pork, hard bread, and watery ale, prepared by cooks who seemed actively hostile to the concept of flavor or nutrition. Work details involved endless maintenance of the castle's crumbling infrastructure, from mucking out stables to repairing walls that seemed determined to collapse despite their efforts. The arrival of Samwell Tarly at Castle Black marked another turning point in Jon's journey toward finding his place among the Night's Watch. Sam arrived as everything Jon was not. Soft where he was hard, learned where he was practical, cowardly where he was brave. The fat boy from the Reach had been forced to take the Black by a father who considered him an embarrassment to their house's martial traditions, a craven who brought shame upon ancestors who had fought with distinction for centuries. Lord Randall Tarly had given his eldest son a choice between the Night's Watch and an arranged hunting accident, leaving Sam little option but to abandon his birthright and seek shelter at the Wall. Sam's arrival provided Sir Alliser Thorne with a new target for his cruelty, someone even more vulnerable than Jon Snow, and thus more satisfying to torment. The Master-at-Arms delighted in forcing the overweight boy through exercises that left him gasping and retching, assigning him opponents who outmatched him in every conceivable way. Thorne's stated justification was that the Watch needed warriors, not weaklings, and that breaking Sam's spirit now might save his life later. The reality was simpler and uglier. The pleasure that cruel men take in tormenting those too weak or gentle to fight back effectively. Jon recognized in Sam's persecution an echo of his own struggles, though magnified by the boy's obvious physical limitations and gentle nature. Where Jon had found refuge in superior training and natural athleticism, Sam possessed no such advantages to fall back upon. His weapons were his mind and his vast knowledge, gained through years of reading in his father's library. But these tools seemed useless in the brutal environment of Castle Black. The other recruits viewed his learning with suspicion and his obvious fear with contempt, seeing both as signs of weakness that had no place among the Brotherhood of the Night's Watch. The friendship between Jon and Sam developed gradually, built on mutual recognition of their status as outsiders within the Watch's harsh hierarchy. Jon saw past Sam's physical limitations to the sharp intelligence and kind heart beneath, qualities that reminded him of Maester Luwin's teachings about looking beyond surface appearances to find true worth. Sam, in turn, recognized in Jon a protector and ally, someone willing to stand between him and the cruelties that seemed to await him at every turn. Their bond transcended the superficial differences that divided them, creating a loyalty that would endure through the darkest challenges either would face. Jon's protection of Sam from the worst of Thorne's persecution required careful navigation of the complex social dynamics that governed life at Castle Black. Direct confrontation with the Master-at-Arms would have resulted in punishment for both boys, while passive acceptance would have left Sam vulnerable to escalating abuse. Instead, Jon employed subtler methods, positioning himself to intervene when Thorne's attention turned toward Sam, offering assistance and encouragement when the fat boy struggled with impossible tasks. He also worked to change the other recruits' perception of Sam, highlighting the boy's knowledge and gentle humor rather than his obvious physical shortcomings. The protection Jon offered Sam extended beyond the training yard into all aspects of their daily lives at Castle Black. He ensured that Sam received adequate portions during meals, knowing that the fat boy's appetite was often used as an excuse to deny him food. He helped Sam with the more physically demanding work details, sharing the burden of tasks that might have proven impossible for one person to complete alone. Most importantly, He offered Sam friendship and acceptance in an environment where both were rare commodities, creating a safe space where the gentle boy could exist without constant fear of mockery or violence. Uncle Benjen's presence at Castle Black provided Jon with a crucial connection to his past life and family, though their relationship proved more complex than he had anticipated during their journey north from Winterfell. Benjen Stark served as First Ranger, leading the Watch's expeditions beyond the Wall into the haunted wilderness that stretched endlessly toward the lands of always winter. His knowledge of the true North was unmatched among the current Brotherhood, earned through decades of ranging that had taken him farther from civilization than any man alive. Yet this expertise came at a cost, marking him with a hardness that Jon had not expected from his father's beloved brother. The First Ranger's duties kept him away from Castle Black for weeks at a time, leading small parties of experienced brothers on missions that grew more dangerous with each passing year. Reports of increased wildling activity, strange lights in the northern sky, and the unexplained abandonment of villages that had endured for generations all demanded investigation. Benjen's Rangers served as the Watch's eyes and ears in the vast wilderness, gathering intelligence about threats that most of the Seven Kingdoms preferred to ignore or dismiss as legend. Their work was lonely, dangerous, and largely thankless, attracting only the most dedicated or desperate members of the Brotherhood. Jon's desire to join his uncle on ranging expeditions was met with firm refusal and gentle explanation, though the disappointment stung nonetheless. Benjen explained that ranging required years of experience and hardening that could not be rushed, that the wilderness beyond the Wall killed the unprepared with casual efficiency. The skills needed to survive in the true North went far beyond swordplay and horsemanship, encompassing woodcraft, tracking, and the ability to sense danger before it manifested. Most importantly, Rangers needed to develop the mental toughness required to function in an environment where death lurked behind every tree and under every snowdrift. The relationship between Jon and his uncle was further complicated by the secrets that Benjen carried about the boy's true parentage, knowledge that created barriers where there might have been intimacy. The First Ranger had been present at the Tower of Joy in the aftermath of his sister's death, helping Ned carry the burden of the promise extracted from Lyanna's lips. He knew better than most the price that secrets could exact from those who kept them, understanding that every lie told in service of a greater truth carried its own weight of guilt and sorrow. His treatment of Jon reflected this knowledge, showing affection tempered by the need to maintain distance, love constrained by duty to his brother's desperate deception. The training continued relentlessly as winter deepened around Castle Black, each day bringing fresh challenges and new lessons in survival. Jon learned to function on little sleep and less food, to ignore pain and exhaustion in service of duty that extended far beyond personal comfort or convenience. He mastered weapons he had never touched at Winterfell, from crossbows to spears, understanding that Rangers needed versatility above specialization. The lessons extended beyond martial skills to encompass basic healing, field repairs of equipment, and the thousand small techniques that separated survivors from corpses in the unforgiving lands beyond the Wall. The great ranging assembled at Castle Black like a gathering storm, the largest force the Night's Watch had mustered in living memory. 300 Black brothers prepared to venture beyond the Wall in search of answers that grew more urgent with each passing day. Benjen Stark's disappearance had shaken the Watch to its foundations. For if the First Ranger could vanish without trace in lands, he knew better than any man alive what hope did lesser brothers have of surviving the growing darkness. Lord Commander Jeor Mormont had made the decision to lead personally, understanding that the realm's safety might depend on discovering the truth about the threats gathering in the far north. Jon Snow rode among the Rangers with a sense of purpose he had never experienced before, finally granted the chance to serve the Watch as more than a training recruit enduring Ser Alliser Thorne's endless humiliations. The weight of Longclaw at his side reminded him constantly of the trust Mormont had placed in him, the Valyrian steel blade representing both honor and responsibility in equal measure. Ghost padded silently beside his horse, the albino direwolf's red eyes scanning the tree line for threats that human senses might miss. The bond between them had deepened during their time at Castle Black, reaching an almost supernatural level of understanding that transcended ordinary communication between man and beast. The column stretched for nearly a mile as it wound through the haunted forest, a black snake of men and horses moving deeper into wilderness that few had ever penetrated and fewer still had returned from alive. Supply wagons groaned under the weight of provisions needed to sustain such a force in lands where game had grown scarce and water often ran foul with mysterious poisons. The brothers maintained discipline despite their fears, understanding that survival depended on unity and obedience to orders that might seem meaningless until the moment they preserved lives. Veterans shared hard-won wisdom with newer recruits, passing down knowledge that could not be learned from books or training, but only earned through bitter experience. The forest itself seemed to watch their passage with malevolent interest, ancient trees pressing close to the narrow paths that served as the only routes through the trackless wilderness. Branches reached down like grasping fingers, while roots threatened to trip horses and send riders tumbling into ravines that disappeared into impenetrable darkness. The very air felt different beyond the wall, thicker somehow, laden with the weight of ages and the accumulated sorrows of countless tragedies. Even veteran rangers found themselves glancing over shoulders and starting at shadows, their instincts warning them that they traveled through lands where natural laws held only tenuous sway. John's education in the realities of ranging began immediately, as experienced brothers taught him to read signs that spoke of dangers both mundane and supernatural. The absence of birdsong indicated predators in the area, while certain types of frost patterns warned of approaching storms that could kill the unprepared within hours. Tracks told stories of the creatures that moved through these woods, from common wolves to bears and stranger things that left marks resembling neither man nor beast. The rangers moved with constant vigilance, understanding that complacency was a luxury that the wilderness beyond the wall never permitted. The first abandoned wildling village they encountered struck the ranging party with its eerie emptiness, huts and halls standing vacant as if their occupants had simply vanished into the frigid air. Cooking fires still smoldered in some hearths, while meals sat half-finished on rough wooden tables, creating the impression that the inhabitants had fled only moments before the Black Brothers arrived. Yet there were no signs of struggle, no blood or bodies to indicate violence, only the profound silence of a community that had ceased to exist without explanation or warning. The brothers searched thoroughly but found nothing to explain the disappearance of people who had lived in these lands for generations. Similar scenes repeated themselves at village after village, each abandonment adding to the growing sense of unease that followed the ranging party like a living shadow. Some settlements showed signs of hasty departure, with belongings scattered and doors left standing open to the elements. Others appeared more organized, as if their residents had time to pack carefully before departing for unknown destinations. The pattern suggested a migration rather than a catastrophe, entire communities moving south toward the wall in response to some threat that the Night's Watch had yet to identify or understand. The journey to Craster's Keep took them through terrain that grew progressively more hostile and unforgiving, testing both men and horses to their limits. Streams ran black with unknown substances that killed animals foolish enough to drink from them, while the ground itself seemed unstable, shifting underfoot in ways that defied natural explanation. The temperature dropped with each mile they traveled north, bringing cold so intense that breath froze in clouds and metal became painful to touch with bare skin. Even the most experienced rangers began to show signs of strain, their faces drawn with exhaustion and growing concern about what they might find at their destination. Craster himself embodied everything that civilized men found repugnant about the wildlings, a creature so foul in appearance and manner that even hardened criminals recoiled from his presence. His keep squatted in a clearing like an infected wound, surrounded by crude huts and pens that housed both animals and the women who served as his wives and daughters simultaneously. The old wildling had survived beyond the wall through a combination of cunning, brutality, and arrangements that decent men preferred not to examine too closely. His knowledge of the northern wilderness was matched only by his willingness to trade that information for supplies and protection that the Night's Watch desperately needed. The hospitality Craster offered his guests carried undertones of threat and mockery that set every ranger on edge, creating an atmosphere of barely controlled tension that could explode into violence at the slightest provocation. His wives moved through the compound like frightened ghosts, their eyes downcast and their voices reduced to whispers when they dared speak at all. The evidence of his depravity surrounded them on every side, from the obvious signs of inbreeding among the children to the complete absence of any males past infancy. Jon found himself struggling to maintain the diplomatic facade that Mormont insisted upon, his sense of justice warring with the practical necessity of maintaining Craster's cooperation. The revelation of Craster's arrangement with the others came to Jon through observation rather than direct confession, the truth emerging through careful attention to details that others might have overlooked. The wildling's boasts about his sons all dying in infancy rang false when combined with the complete absence of graves or burial sites around the keep. His wives' terrified reactions to questions about male children suggested secrets too terrible for open discussion. Most damning of all was Craster's obvious confidence in his own safety, a security that seemed to derive from sources beyond mere isolation or defensive preparations. Jon's discovery of Craster's midnight ritual in the woods beyond the keep revealed the full horror of the arrangement that had kept the wildling alive, while other settlements fell to mysterious threats. He watched in shock as the old man placed a newborn infant on a crude altar of ice and stone, leaving the child exposed to elements that should have meant certain death. The white walker that emerged from the shadows moved with inhuman grace, its pale flesh seemingly immune to the cold that would kill mortal men within minutes. The creature's acceptance of Craster's offering confirmed suspicions that had been growing in Jon's mind, revealing a conspiracy between human monsters and supernatural ones that challenged everything he thought he knew about the world. The confrontation that followed Jon's discovery of this blasphemous arrangement tested both his courage and his understanding of the complex moral compromises that survival sometimes demanded. Craster's threat to expel the entire ranging party from his lands carried weight, for the brothers desperately needed the shelter and supplies that only he could provide in the vast wilderness. Lord Commander Mormont's reluctant acceptance of the situation revealed the harsh pragmatism that command required, the willingness to stomach atrocities in service of larger goals that transcended personal honor or moral purity. The knowledge Jon carried of Craster's crimes weighed on his conscience like a physical burden, creating internal conflicts that no training could have prepared him to face. His oath to the Night's Watch demanded obedience to his commanders, yet his honor rebelled against complicity in the sacrifice of innocent children to creatures of nightmare. The helpless rage he felt at his inability to intervene would poison his relationship with authority figures for years to come, teaching him hard lessons about the price of duty when it conflicted with basic human decency. The ranging party's departure from Craster's keep carried them deeper into lands where winter reigned eternal, following ancient paths that led toward the heart of the growing darkness. The fist of the first men rose from the wilderness like a monument to forgotten ages, its ringed heights offering both defensive advantages and symbolic significance that was not lost on the brothers who made camp within its ancient walls. The fortification had been built by the first men thousands of years before the coming of the Andals, constructed during the long night when humanity faced extinction at the hands of creatures that most now considered mere legend. The convergence of other watch forces at the Fist brought together veterans from every manned castle along the wall, creating a concentration of experience and knowledge that had not been seen in generations. Corin Halfhand arrived from the Shadow Tower with his hand-picked rangers, men whose skills in the wilderness approached the legendary. Their stories of increased wildling activity and strange sightings in the far north added crucial intelligence to the growing picture of threats that seemed to be converging from all directions simultaneously. Corin himself represented everything that Jon aspired to become as a ranger, a man whose reputation for courage and skill was matched only by his wisdom and tactical brilliance. The loss of fingers on his sword hand had forced him to adapt his fighting style in ways that made him even more dangerous than before, proving that true warriors could overcome any handicap through determination and intelligence. His presence at the Fist brought both hope and grim acknowledgement that the situation had grown desperate enough to require the Watch's most experienced leaders to take personal command of field operations. The plan that emerged from the War Council reflected both the urgency of their mission and the limitations imposed by their small numbers and hostile environment. Small parties of rangers would spread throughout the wilderness, gathering intelligence about wildling movements while avoiding direct confrontation with forces that outnumbered them dramatically. The strategy required splitting their already modest force into vulnerable fragments, accepting increased risk in exchange for better information about threats that remained largely mysterious, despite growing evidence of their presence. Jon's assignment to Corin's group represented both honor and danger, placing him under the command of the Watch's most legendary ranger, while exposing him to risks that few recruits survived. The half-hand had specifically requested Ned Stark's bastard, recognizing qualities in the young man that others had overlooked or dismissed. The mission would take them into the heart of wildling territory, seeking to capture prisoners who might reveal the true scope of the threat gathering beyond the wall. Success would provide crucial intelligence, while failure would likely result in death or capture by enemies who showed no mercy to their prisoners. The small band of rangers that accompanied Corin represented the cream of the Night's Watch, men whose skills had been proven through years of survival in conditions that killed the unprepared without hesitation. Each possessed specialized knowledge that contributed to the group's effectiveness, from tracking and wilderness survival to combat techniques adapted for the unique challenges of fighting beyond the wall. Their acceptance of Jon into their ranks marked a significant milestone in his development as a ranger, acknowledgement that he had earned the right to stand alongside the Brotherhood's finest warriors. The journey into the Skirling Pass took them through terrain that seemed designed to kill travelers, with narrow paths that wound between towering peaks where avalanches could be triggered by sounds as quiet as a horse's whinny. The air itself became their enemy, so thin and cold that each breath felt like swallowing knives. The rangers moved in single file, each step carefully placed to avoid triggering rock slides that could bury the entire party beneath tons of stone and ice. The silence they maintained was not merely tactical but essential for survival. Any unnecessary sound potentially bringing death down upon them from the heights above. The wildling watchers they sought proved more elusive than expected, using knowledge of local terrain to avoid detection while maintaining surveillance of the passes that served as gateways between the far north and the lands closer to the wall. These scouts represented the eyes and ears of Mance Rayder's growing army, gathering intelligence that would prove crucial when the King Beyond the Wall finally moved south with his massive force. Their capture or elimination was essential to maintaining any element of surprise for future Watch operations. Yet their wilderness skills made them formidable opponents, even for experienced rangers. The ambush that finally brought them into contact with the wildling scouts unfolded with the sudden violence that characterized all combat in the wilderness, erupting from apparent calm into desperate struggle within heartbeats. Corin's tactical brilliance was evident in the planning and execution of the attack, using terrain and surprise to overcome the numerical disadvantage that typically favored their enemies. The brief but vicious fight left several wildlings dead and one captured, a young woman whose fierce beauty was matched only by her obvious hatred for the black-clad men who had killed her companions. Ygritte embodied everything that separated the free folk from the kneelers south of the wall. Her proud independence and casual contempt for authority, marking her as a true daughter of the wilderness. Her flame-red hair and gray eyes spoke of First Men ancestry that predated the coming of Andals to Westeros by thousands of years, connecting her to bloodlines that had ruled as kings before the conquest brought unity to the fractured kingdoms. Her knowledge of the northern wilderness was extensive, earned through years of ranging with war parties that had penetrated deep into lands that maps labeled as empty wastes, but which actually teemed with hidden life. The decision to use Jon as her executioner revealed the depth of Horin's strategic thinking, recognizing opportunities to advance multiple objectives simultaneously through actions that appeared straightforward on the surface. The test of Jon's commitment to the Watch was obvious. But the half-hand also saw possibilities for infiltration that could provide intelligence impossible to obtain through conventional means. His understanding of wildling psychology allowed him to predict their likely reactions to events that seemed random, but were actually carefully orchestrated to serve larger purposes. Jon's inability to execute an unarmed prisoner revealed both his essential humanity and his potential vulnerability, qualities that would define his character throughout the challenges ahead. His reluctance to kill someone who posed no immediate threat spoke well of his moral development, but poorly of his suitability for the harsh realities of ranging beyond the wall. The moment of hesitation that allowed Ygritte to escape was simultaneously his greatest failure and his most human moment, establishing patterns that would recur throughout his service to causes greater than himself. The pursuit that followed Ygritte's escape took Jon deeper into wilderness that grew more hostile with each mile, testing his skills and endurance against terrain that had killed more experienced rangers. His determination to recapture the escaped prisoner drove him beyond the limits of prudence, separating him from his companions in pursuit of redemption for his perceived failure. The lesson he learned about the dangers of acting alone would serve him well in future challenges, though at the cost of placing himself in mortal peril among enemies who had every reason to want him dead. The wildling pursuit of Jon Snow through the treacherous mountain passes above the Skirling Pass became a deadly game of hunter and hunted, with roles shifting constantly as terrain and circumstance dictated advantage. Ygritte moved through the rocky wilderness with the fluid grace of someone born to such harsh landscapes, her knowledge of every cave and crevice allowing her to disappear and reappear like a ghost made flesh. Jon's desperation to recapture his escaped prisoner drove him beyond the bounds of caution, pursuing her across ledges where a single misstep would send him plummeting to his death on the jagged rocks below. The chase stretched through the long twilight of the northern summer, each participant testing the other's endurance and determination in a contest where failure meant death. The wildling woman led him through a maze of ancient stone formations that seemed to shift and change in the uncertain light, creating optical illusions that made pursuit even more treacherous than the terrain itself demanded. Jon found himself questioning his own senses, as paths that had seemed clear moments before vanished into impassable walls of granite, while routes that appeared blocked revealed themselves as cunningly concealed passages when approached from different angles. Ygritte's intimate knowledge of these natural fortifications gave her every advantage, allowing her to choose the terms of their deadly dance, while Jon struggled simply to maintain contact with his quarry. The pursuit finally ended when exhaustion and the growing darkness forced both hunter and hunted to seek shelter in a shallow cave, barely large enough to accommodate two people in relative comfort. Jon's discovery of Ygritte's hiding place should have ended the chase in his favor, yet he found himself hesitating once again when faced with the necessity of violence against someone who posed no immediate threat to his safety. The wildling woman sat calmly beside a small fire, apparently unconcerned by his approach, her gray eyes reflecting flames that seemed to dance with mischief rather than fear. Her casual acceptance of capture suggested either resignation to fate or confidence in abilities that Jon had yet to discover. The conversation that developed between captor and captive revealed depths of character and philosophy that neither had expected to find in their enemy, creating connections that transcended the superficial differences imposed by birth and allegiance. Ygritte spoke of freedom with a passion that made Jon question assumptions he had never thought to examine, describing a way of life where worth was measured by deed rather than birth, and where the strongest led not through inherited title but through demonstrated capability. Her contempt for the artificial barriers that Southern society erected between classes struck Jon with particular force, reminding him of his own struggles with bastard status and the limitations it imposed upon his aspirations. The wildling woman's knowledge of the lands beyond the wall proved encyclopedic, encompassing not merely practical information about survival and navigation, but also the deeper histories that connected her people to bloodlines older than recorded memory. She spoke of the first men with the reverence that others reserved for gods, describing ancestors who had ruled as kings before the Andal invasion brought new customs and beliefs to Westeros. Her stories painted pictures of a golden age when the free folk had lived in harmony with the ancient powers that still stirred in the deepest wilderness, before the wall had divided families and peoples who shared common heritage, stretching back to the dawn of human settlement. Jon found himself drawn into philosophical discussions that challenged every assumption about loyalty and duty that his upbringing at Winterfell had instilled in him, forcing him to examine beliefs he had never questioned. Ygritte's arguments about the arbitrary nature of political boundaries possessed a logic that was difficult to refute particularly when delivered by someone who had never known the security that walls and laws provided to those born within their protection. Her descriptions of wildling society revealed complexities that contradicted the simple savagery that Southerners attributed to the free folk, showing structures and traditions that served their people's needs, without requiring the rigid hierarchies that characterized the Seven Kingdoms. The growing attraction between Jon and his captive developed despite every rational consideration that should have prevented such feelings, creating tensions that neither fully understood nor could easily control. Ygritte's beauty was wild and untamed, reflecting the harsh landscape that had shaped her character and values, while her intelligence and fierce independence challenged Jon's preconceptions about what women could be when freed from the constraints that Southern society imposed upon them. Her casual discussions of topics that would have scandalized ladies of noble birth revealed a freedom of thought and expression that Jon found both shocking and strangely appealing. The nights they spent together in the wilderness created an intimacy that transcended physical proximity, built upon shared dangers and mutual dependence that stripped away the pretenses that civilization normally demanded. Jon found himself sharing thoughts and dreams that he had never revealed to anyone, speaking of his struggles with bastard status and his desperate desire to prove himself worthy of the name he bore, despite lacking legal right to claim it. Ygritte listened without judgment, offering perspectives that helped him see his situation in new ways, while sharing her own experiences as someone who had chosen to live entirely outside the structures that most people accepted without question. The ambush that finally ended Jon's unauthorized ranging came without warning, erupting from apparently empty terrain with the sudden violence that characterized all combat in the wilderness beyond the wall. Orell and his band of wildling scouts had been tracking them for days, using skills honed by lifetimes spent hunting both animals and men across the trackless wastes. Their approach through terrain that Jon had thought impassable demonstrated abilities that surpassed anything he had learned during his training with the Night's Watch, revealing the vast gaps that still existed in his education as a ranger and warrior. The capture by Orell's band transformed Jon from hunter to hunted, placing him at the mercy of wildlings whose hatred for the Night's Watch had been forged through generations of conflict and bloodshed. The Skin Changer's control over his eagle allowed him to gather intelligence and coordinate attacks with supernatural precision, making him far more dangerous than his unremarkable appearance suggested. His obvious desire for Ygritte added personal animosity to political hatred, creating a volatile combination that threatened to explode into violence at any provocation. Qhorin Halfhand's arrival with the surviving members of their ranging party should have provided rescue and relief. Yet the legendary ranger's actions defied every expectation that Jon possessed about duty, loyalty, and honor. The Halfhand's apparent abandonment of his sworn brother in favor of political expediency struck Jon like a physical blow, shattering beliefs about the Night's Watch that had sustained him through years of hardship and disappointment. The accusations of cowardice and betrayal that Qhorin leveled against him seemed to confirm every doubt that Jon had ever harbored about his own worthiness to wear the black. The fight that Qhorin orchestrated between himself and Jon represented the culmination of strategic thinking that extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of their captivity, encompassing plans and contingencies that Jon could not begin to understand. The Halfhand's whispered instructions during their apparently hostile confrontation revealed layers of deception that transformed everything Jon thought he knew about their situation. Yet the emotional impact of seemingly being abandoned by his mentor cut deeply regardless of strategic necessity. The lesson in sacrifice that Qhorin taught through his own death would haunt Jon for years to come, demonstrating the prices that true leadership sometimes demanded. The killing of Qhorin Halfhand marked Jon's final transition from Night's Watch recruit to something else entirely, though the true nature of his new role remained unclear even to himself. The legendary ranger's death at his hands provided the credibility necessary for infiltrating the wildling army, yet the act violated every oath and principle that had previously defined Jon's sense of identity and purpose. The blood on Longclaw's blade seemed to burn like acid, marking him as both kinslayer and oathbreaker in the eyes of men whose respect he had spent years earning through dedication and sacrifice. Ygritte's reaction to Corin's death revealed the complex loyalties and emotions that the violence beyond the wall could create, showing both satisfaction at the Ranger's fate and unexpected sympathy for Jon's obvious anguish. Her understanding of the choices that survival sometimes demanded allowed her to see past the immediate brutality to the deeper currents that had shaped events, recognizing sacrifices that others might interpret as mere expedients. The comfort she offered came without condescension or judgment, acknowledging pain while accepting necessities that gentler souls might refuse to contemplate. The journey to Mance Rayder's camp took them through landscapes that grew progressively more alien and threatening, revealing wildernesses that existed entirely outside the boundaries of mapped and civilized lands. The Frostfang Mountains rose like jagged teeth against skies that seemed perpetually stormy, their peaks shrouded in clouds that never quite concealed the strange lights that flickered within their depths. The very air felt different at such altitudes, thin and sharp with cold that penetrated clothing and flesh to settle in bones and souls with equal efficiency. The wildling army that gathered in those frozen valleys defied every assumption that Jon had formed about the free folk during his time at Castle Black and beyond the wall. Instead of the ragged bands of raiders that watch reports typically described, he found himself confronting a migration of unprecedented scale and organization, complete families traveling together with their possessions and livestock in a movement that encompassed entire peoples. Children played among the camps, while elders shared stories and wisdom that preserved traditions stretching back to the earliest days of human settlement in the north. Giants walked among the wildlings like living legends made flesh, their presence transforming myth into reality, with casual indifference to the awe and terror they inspired in those who had never seen such creatures before. These ancient beings possessed intelligence and culture that marked them as far more than mere beasts. Yet their alien nature made communication difficult, even for those willing to attempt such contact. Their mastery of mammoths created a cavalry force unlike anything that southern armies had ever faced, combining the unstoppable momentum of massive animals with the tactical intelligence of riders who understood warfare in ways that transcended mere brutality. Mance Rayder himself proved to be perhaps the greatest surprise in a journey filled with revelations that challenged Jon's understanding of the world beyond the wall. The king beyond the wall bore little resemblance to the savage chieftain that watch reports had described, presenting instead as a man of obvious intelligence and charisma who had somehow managed to unite dozens of fractious clans into a single massive army. His knowledge of southern customs and military tactics revealed education that went far beyond what most wildlings possessed, suggesting backgrounds and experiences that his current position did not fully explain. The test that Mance set for Jon regarding his motivations for abandoning the Night's Watch required careful navigation between truth and deception, revealing information that would establish credibility without exposing the true purpose of his mission. Jon's description of witnessing Craster's sacrifices to the others provided both explanation for his supposed disillusionment and valuable intelligence about threats that even the wildlings feared. The king beyond the wall's reaction to this information confirmed suspicions about the supernatural forces that drove the Great Migration, adding urgency to plans that already carried the weight of tribal survival. The integration of Jon into the wildling army created challenges that went far beyond simple questions of loyalty and identity, forcing him to adapt to social structures and expectations that differed fundamentally from everything his upbringing had taught him. The free folks' casual attitude toward violence and their contempt for the artificial distinctions that characterized Southern society required constant adjustment of behavior and thought patterns that had been ingrained since childhood. His obvious education and noble bearing marked him as different, even when he attempted to blend in, creating suspicions that only Ygritte's protection and advocacy could overcome. The relationship between Jon and Ygritte deepened into something approaching genuine love, despite the circumstances that had brought them together and the deceptions that necessarily colored every interaction between them. Her fierce independence and casual disregard for conventional morality challenged him to examine assumptions about women and relationships that his sheltered upbringing had never questioned. The freedom she represented seemed to offer alternatives to the rigid structures that had constrained his entire life. suggesting possibilities for happiness and fulfillment that bastard status had previously made impossible to imagine. The mission to scale the wall represented both the ultimate test of Jon's apparent conversion to the wildling cause and his best opportunity to warn Castle Black of the approaching assault that threatened to overwhelm the undermanned fortifications. The small band selected for this dangerous task included some of the most skilled climbers among the free folk, men and women whose abilities on rock and ice approached the supernatural in their precision and daring. The route they would attempt had never been successfully climbed before, requiring techniques and equipment that pushed the boundaries of what human skill and courage could accomplish. The ascent of the wall itself became an epic of endurance and determination that tested every member of the climbing party to the absolute limits of their capabilities, transforming the Great Barrier from mere obstacle into active opponent that seemed determined to claim their lives. The ancient ice revealed itself as treacherous and unstable, shot through with hidden flaws that could give way without warning and send climbers plummeting to their deaths on the rocks below. Each handhold required careful testing, while every upward step carried the risk of triggering avalanches that could sweep away the entire party in moments of thunderous destruction. Orell's attempt to murder Jon and Ygritte during the climb revealed the depths of jealousy and hatred that personal animosities could reach, creating dangers that transcended the already considerable risks imposed by terrain and weather. The Skin Changer's willingness to sacrifice the mission's success in favor of eliminating a romantic rival demonstrated the volatile emotions that could undermine even the most carefully planned operations. His severing of their climbing rope should have meant certain death for both Jon and Ygritte, yet their survival through skill and determination only increased his resentment and desire for revenge. The moment of reaching the wall's summit represented triumph over obstacles that had seemed insurmountable. Yet it also marked Jon's final commitment to a path that would inevitably lead to betrayal and heartbreak. The view from the top encompassed both the lands he had left behind and the wilderness he had learned to love, symbolizing the impossible choice between duty and desire that would define the rest of his life. Ygritte's wonder at seeing the civilized lands spread below them created a moment of shared beauty that transcended the violence and deception surrounding their relationship, offering glimpses of what love might accomplish in a world not torn by ancient conflicts and divided loyalties. The return to Castle Black should have brought Jon Snow the satisfaction of duty fulfilled and mission accomplished, yet the weight of deception and betrayal hung around his shoulders like chains forged from his own compromises. The massive gates of black iron groaned open to admit the small party of survivors, their passage marking the end of one ordeal and the beginning of another far more complex and dangerous. Sir Alliser Thorne's suspicious gaze followed Jon's every movement, the Master-at-Arms clearly recognizing that something fundamental had changed in the bastard's bearing and demeanor during his time beyond the wall. The presence of wildlings within Castle Black's ancient halls created tensions that crackled like lightning before a storm, threatening to explode into violence at the slightest provocation. Ygritte's defiance in the face of her captivity embodied everything that separated the free folk from the kneelers south of the wall, her proud refusal to show fear or submission, marking her as a true daughter of the wilderness. Her flame-red hair seemed to burn even brighter within the confines of stone walls, while her gray eyes surveyed her surroundings with the calculating intelligence of a predator, assessing potential threats and opportunities. The casual contempt she displayed for the Night's Watch and everything it represented struck the Black brothers like slaps across their faces, challenging assumptions about honor and duty that many had never thought to question. The interrogation that followed Jon's return revealed the complex web of loyalties and deceptions that his mission beyond the wall had created, forcing him to navigate between truth and lies with a skill that would have impressed the most accomplished courtiers in King's Landing. His account of Qhorin Halfhand's death required careful crafting to maintain his cover while honoring the legendary ranger's sacrifice, creating a version of events that served multiple masters simultaneously. The suspicion in Thorne's eyes made clear that the Master-at-Arms detected inconsistencies in Jon's story, yet lacked sufficient evidence to challenge the bastard's claims directly. Samwell Tarly's joy at his friend's safe return provided one of the few bright moments in Jon's increasingly dark world, the fat boy's genuine affection serving as a reminder of bonds that transcended politics and deception. Sam's questions about life among the wildlings required careful answers that would satisfy curiosity without revealing secrets that could cost lives on both sides of the wall. The friendship between them had deepened during their shared experiences at Castle Black, creating loyalties that Jon found increasingly difficult to balance against his growing sympathy for the free folk and their cause. The intelligence Jon provided about Mance Rayder's army should have galvanized the Night's Watch into immediate action, yet the brothers' response revealed the institutional paralysis that had infected the organization over decades of decline and neglect. Lord Commander Mormont's death during the mutiny at Craster's Keep had left leadership questions unresolved, while the Watch's depleted numbers made effective defense of the wall seem increasingly impossible, regardless of how much warning they received. The political maneuvering that followed Jon's briefings demonstrated how personal ambitions could undermine collective security, even in the face of existential threats. The election for the new Lord Commander became a contest between Ser Alliser Thorne and Ser Denise Mallister, two men whose qualifications for leadership were matched only by their mutual animosity and conflicting visions for the Watch's future. Thorne represented the harsh traditionalism that had sustained the organization through centuries of hardship, advocating for discipline and unwavering commitment to ancient oaths regardless of changing circumstances. Mallister offered a more flexible approach that recognized the need for adaptation and compromise, yet his reasonable moderation seemed inadequate to address the unprecedented challenges facing the Brotherhood. Samwell Tarly's nomination of Jon Snow as a third candidate for Lord Commander shocked everyone present, transforming what should have been a straightforward choice between established leaders into a complex three-way contest with unpredictable outcomes. The Fat Boy's passionate speech about Jon's leadership during the defense of Castle Black revealed depths of political understanding that few had suspected him of possessing, while his strategic thinking about vote counting demonstrated skills that transcended his academic reputation. The nervous energy that followed his unexpected intervention filled the hall like smoke, creating possibilities that neither traditional candidate had anticipated or prepared for. The tied vote between Jon and Thorne created a moment of perfect tension, with the future of the Night's Watch balanced on the edge of Maester Aemon's deciding ballot. The blind Maester's deliberation seemed to stretch for hours, though it lasted only moments, his ancient fingers testing the weight of tokens that would determine not merely leadership, but the organization's response to threats that could destroy everything they had sworn to protect. The circular token that designated Jon as the 998th Lord Commander fell into the counting bowl like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond Castle Black's walls. The elevation of a bastard barely past his 17th name day to command the Night's Watch represented either inspired recognition of merit or dangerous departure from traditions that had sustained the organization through 8,000 years of service. Jon's youth and relative inexperience made his selection controversial even among those who had voted for him, while his known associations with wildlings created additional concerns about his judgment and loyalties. The weight of command settled upon shoulders that seemed too young and narrow to bear such responsibilities, yet the desperate circumstances facing the Watch left little room for conventional considerations of age and experience. King Stannis Baratheon's presence at Castle Black added layers of complexity to Jon's new position that extended far beyond the immediate challenges of defending the wall against wildling assault. The would-be king's offer of legitimization and lordship of Winterfell represented everything that Jon had dreamed of achieving since childhood, the chance to transform bastard status into noble birthright through a simple declaration of royal will. Yet acceptance would require abandoning vows that had come to define his identity, betraying brothers who had entrusted him with their lives and futures in service of personal ambition disguised as duty to the realm. The strategic situation facing the new Lord Commander seemed nearly hopeless when viewed objectively, with a massive wildling army approaching walls that were undermanned and undersupplied by orders of magnitude. Mance Rayder's forces outnumbered the Watch's defenders by ratios that made conventional military resistance seem futile, while the approaching winter would make extended siege warfare impossible for both sides. The Night's Watch possessed advantages in fortification and equipment, yet these benefits paled beside the arithmetic of overwhelming numerical disadvantage that characterized their position. Jon's first major decision as Lord Commander involved the controversial execution of Janos Slynt, the former commander of the City Watch, whose cowardice and insubordination had made him a liability that the Watch could no longer afford to tolerate. The Fat Knight's refusal to obey direct orders in front of the entire garrison created a challenge to Jon's authority that demanded immediate and decisive response. Yet the brutality required to maintain discipline sat uneasily with the young commander's natural inclinations toward mercy. The swing of Longclaw that severed Slynt's head from his shoulders established Jon's willingness to enforce discipline regardless of personal feelings, sending messages about leadership that reached far beyond the immediate circumstances. The negotiations with Mance Rayder required Jon to draw upon every lesson in diplomacy and statecraft that his noble upbringing had provided, balancing the competing demands of multiple constituencies, while seeking solutions that could prevent catastrophic bloodshed. The King Beyond the Wall's willingness to treat with the Night's Watch demonstrated pragmatism that transcended the savage reputation that Southern propaganda had created around him, revealing a leader whose primary concern was the survival of his people, rather than conquest for its own sake. The discussions that followed revealed common ground that neither side had expected to find, creating possibilities for cooperation that seemed impossible given the history of conflict between wildlings and the Watch. The revelation of the true threat posed by the others transformed the entire strategic equation, shifting focus from traditional human conflicts to supernatural dangers that threatened all life south of the Wall. Mance's army was not invading, but fleeing, driven south by creatures of legend that had somehow returned to plague the world of men. The ancient enemy that the Night's Watch had been created to fight had awakened from millennia of slumber, bringing with them powers that made conventional military thinking obsolete. The choice facing Jon and Mance was no longer about territory or sovereignty, but about survival itself in the face of extinction that recognized no boundaries between wildling and kneeler. The controversial decision to allow wildlings to settle south of the Wall represented Jon's most radical departure from Night's Watch tradition, challenging assumptions about duty and honor that had governed the organization since its founding. His argument that every wildling left north of the Wall would eventually become a white in the other's army possessed undeniable logic, yet the emotional impact of allying with ancient enemies proved difficult for many brothers to accept. The decision required Jon to balance long-term strategic thinking against immediate concerns about morale and discipline, calculating risks that extended far beyond simple military considerations. Stannis Baratheon's departure for Winterfell removed both temptation and protection from Jon's increasingly precarious position, leaving him to face growing opposition from within the Watch's ranks without the implicit threat of royal intervention. The King's offer of legitimization continued to haunt Jon's thoughts, even after its formal rejection, representing roads not taken and possibilities foreclosed by duty to oaths that seemed increasingly meaningless in the face of approaching apocalypse. The sacrifice of personal desire in favor of sworn obligations would define Jon's character for years to come, establishing patterns of behavior that would shape his response to future challenges. The mission to Hardhome represented both humanitarian necessity and strategic opportunity, offering the chance to rescue thousands of wildlings while demonstrating the Night's Watch's commitment to protecting all human life regardless of political allegiance. The ancient fishing village had become a gathering point for free folk fleeing the advancing parters. Others, its defensible position making it seem like a sanctuary, even as its isolation made escape increasingly difficult. Jon's decision to lead the rescue mission personally reflected both practical considerations about wildling trust and personal need to see the true scope of the threat facing all humanity. The sea voyage to Hardhome carried Jon farther from Castle Black than he had traveled since returning from his mission beyond the Wall, taking him into waters that few Southerners had ever navigated successfully. The ships provided by Stannis Baratheon represented a significant portion of the royal fleet, their crews nervous about venturing into northern waters where sea monsters and worse things were said to hunt beneath the waves. The journey itself became an education in the vastness of the lands beyond the Wall, revealing wildernesses that stretched beyond the horizon in all directions without showing signs of human habitation or influence. The arrival at Hardhome revealed a community in the final stages of desperate preparation for evacuation, as thousands of wildlings struggled to organize themselves for a journey that would take them away from lands their ancestors had occupied for countless generations. The scale of the migration dwarfed anything that Southern historians had recorded, encompassing entire tribes and cultures that had maintained independence since the dawn of human settlement in the north. Children played among piles of belongings that represented everything their families owned in the world, while elders shared stories and wisdom that preserved traditions, stretching back to the earliest days of human memory. The negotiations with the wildling chieftains required Jon to balance competing demands and ancient grudges that had shaped relationships between various tribes for centuries before his birth. Some leaders embraced the opportunity to escape the approaching winter and the threats that came with it, recognizing in Jon's offer the best hope for their people's survival. Others viewed any cooperation with the Night's Watch as betrayal of ancestors who had died fighting the Black Brothers, preferring to face certain death rather than accept help from traditional enemies. The debates that followed revealed the complex political structures that governed wildling society, hierarchies based on merit and charisma rather than birth or inherited title. The attack that interrupted these negotiations came without warning, erupting from the frozen wasteland with a violence that transformed rescue mission into desperate struggle for survival. The others arrived like a tide of winter given malevolent form, their white servants shambling forward in numbers that seemed to stretch beyond counting. The ancient enemy that songs described as creatures of ice and shadow proved even more terrible in reality. Beings whose very presence seemed to drain warmth and hope from the world around them. Their weapons of crystalline ice cut through steel and flesh with equal ease, while their supernatural cold turned blood to slush in living veins. The battle that followed became an epic of heroism and horror that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives, pitting human courage against supernatural malevolence in combat that defied every assumption about warfare and death. Jon's skills with Longclaw proved crucial in the early fighting, the Valyrian steel blade cutting through white flesh with an effectiveness that ordinary weapons could not match. The discovery that dragonglass could destroy the animated dead provided hope and tactical advantage, yet the sheer numbers of the enemy made victory seem increasingly impossible, despite individual acts of extraordinary bravery. The duel between Jon and the White Walker became the battle's crucial turning point, transforming what had seemed like inevitable defeat into unexpected opportunity for resistance and escape. The ancient creature moved with inhuman grace and speed, its ice blade singing through the air with deadly precision that nearly overwhelmed Jon's desperate defenses. The moment when Longclaw's Valyrian steel met the Walker's weapon of ice created a confrontation between old magic and new, fire and winter, life and death, made manifest in single combat. The shattering of the ice blade and the destruction of its wielder sent shockwaves through the White Army, destroying hundreds of animated corpses in moments as their controlling will was severed. The evacuation of Hardhome's survivors became a race against time as the remaining others pressed their attack with renewed fury, their assault growing more desperate as they sensed their quarry escaping toward the ships that represented salvation. The narrow pier that connected the village to deep water became a bottleneck where heroes were made and legends born. Each minute of delay bought with blood and courage that transcended ordinary human limitations. Jon's leadership during the retreat inspired acts of selflessness and bravery that saved countless lives, yet the cost in dead and missing haunted him with questions about the price of command and the value of individual survival in the face of species extinction. The Night King's appearance at the climax of the battle transformed retreat into revelation, as Jon found himself face to face with the ancient enemy that had haunted human nightmares since the Long Night. The creature's blue eyes held intelligence that was both alien and terrifyingly familiar, suggesting awareness and purpose that transcended mere animal hunger for destruction. The casual gesture that raised all of Hardhome's dead as new whites demonstrated power that made conventional military thinking obsolete, revealing capabilities that could render even the largest armies meaningless in moments. The message was clear and unmistakable. Death itself had become the enemy's greatest weapon, and every human casualty would strengthen their forces while weakening resistance. The return journey to Castle Black carried survivors who had seen the face of extinction and lived to bear witness to horrors that most would dismiss as impossible fantasies. The ships groaned under the weight of refugees, whose entire world had been reduced to whatever they could carry during the desperate evacuation. Families clutching possessions and memories that represented everything they had managed to save from the advancing darkness. Jon's own burden was heavier than physical cargo, encompassing knowledge of the enemy's true capabilities and the growing certainty that the wall's defenses were utterly inadequate to protect the Seven Kingdoms from what was coming. The reception that awaited Jon's return to Castle Black revealed the depth of opposition that his wildling policies had created among the brothers. Suspicion and resentment that had been building during his absence, now given voice by those who questioned both his judgment and his loyalties. Sir Alistair Thorne's criticism cut particularly deep because it contained elements of truth that Jon could not entirely refute, valid concerns about the dangers of admitting traditional enemies into the heart of the Watch's defensive positions. The younger brothers looked to their Lord Commander for reassurance that his radical policies would prove successful, yet Jon's own doubts made such confidence increasingly difficult to project convincingly. Ollie's transformation from hero to potential threat reflected the broader challenges that Jon faced in maintaining unity within an organization torn between competing visions of duty and honor. The boy's hatred of wildlings was both personal and justified, rooted in trauma that made rational evaluation of changing circumstances nearly impossible despite his obvious intelligence and courage. His questions about Jon's policies carried the weight of innocent confusion rather than calculated malice, yet they revealed cracks in the foundation of support that the Lord Commander needed to maintain his authority and implement his vision for the Watch's future. The conspiracy that formed around Jon's controversial leadership drew together brothers, united by little beyond their shared conviction that the bastard's policies would destroy the Night's Watch and everything it represented. Bowen Marsh's participation lent respectability to the plot, his reputation for careful stewardship making his opposition seem reasonable rather than treasonous to those who might otherwise have remained loyal. Othel Yarwick's involvement added the support of the builders, while various stewards and rangers contributed numbers that made the conspiracy formidable, despite its lack of inspired leadership or clear vision for alternatives to Jon's approach. The trap that finally brought Jon's command to its violent end was baited with hope rather than fear, using his love for family and his desperation to find his missing uncle as weapons more effective than any sword. The false report of Benjen Stark's survival beyond the wall played upon emotions and loyalties that made rational evaluation impossible, drawing the Lord Commander away from his guards and into a courtyard where his enemies waited with drawn steel. The sign marked "Traitor" revealed the conspiracy's justification for their intended action, transforming murder into execution in their own minds through the simple expedient of declaring their victim guilty of crimes that existed more in perception than reality. The assassination of Jon Snow became a ritual of betrayal that bound the conspirators together through shared guilt while destroying whatever remained of the Night's Watch's moral authority and unity. Each thrust of steel was accompanied by the phrase, "For the Watch," transforming personal hatred and political disagreement into sacred duty in the minds of those who wielded the blades. Sir Alistair Thorne's participation lent the crime an air of official sanction, while the presence of younger brothers like Ollie demonstrated how thoroughly the poison of division had spread throughout the organization. The multiple wounds that brought Jon down ensured that responsibility was shared among many hands rather than concentrated in a single assassin, creating collective guilt that made individual redemption nearly impossible. The final moments of Jon's life were marked not by rage or fear, but by profound disappointment in the brothers he had tried so hard to serve and protect, the realization that his sacrifice had been not only unappreciated, but actively resented by those it was meant to benefit. The cold that seeped into his body from the frozen ground seemed to carry with it the chill of understanding that noble intentions were no guarantee of noble outcomes, that even the most selfless actions could be misinterpreted by those who lacked the vision to see beyond immediate circumstances. The darkness that closed around his vision brought with it a strange peace, the relief of laying down burdens that had proven too heavy for shoulders that were still too young and inexperienced to bear the weight of saving the world. The howling of Ghost pierced the frigid air of Castle Black like a blade through silence, the dire wolf's mournful cries summoning loyal brothers to discover what the conspirators had left bleeding in the snow. Davos Seaworth found himself thrust into leadership of a desperate situation he had never expected to face. The one-time smuggler's practical wisdom suddenly crucial for navigating the treacherous aftermath of assassination within the Night's Watch. Edison Tollett's grim humor could not mask the horror etched across his weathered features as he gazed upon the body of the young Lord Commander, while the handful of brothers who remained loyal to Jon's memory formed a protective circle around their fallen leader with drawn swords and desperate determination. The sight of Jon Snow's corpse shocked even men who had witnessed countless deaths during their service beyond the Wall. The multiple wounds, speaking of hatred that transcended mere political disagreement to become something approaching religious fervor. Blood had frozen beneath his body in crimson pools that reflected the torchlight like scattered rubies, while his face retained an expression of profound disappointment rather than pain or fear. The bastard who had risen to command the Night's Watch lay still as carved stone, his skin already taking on the waxy pallor that marked the recently dead in the unforgiving cold of the north. Ser Alliser Thorne's assumption of authority in the wake of the assassination carried with it the weight of institutional legitimacy, yet his position remained tenuous given the divided loyalties that the conspiracy had revealed within the Watch's ranks. The Master-at-Arms moved quickly to consolidate power, placing his supporters in key positions while attempting to justify the murder as necessary action to preserve the organization's traditional values and mission. His proclamations about restoring order and discipline rang hollow to those who remembered Jon's leadership during the battle against the wildlings. Yet fear of further violence kept many brothers silent, despite their private reservations about the conspiracy's methods. The standoff that developed around Jon's body reflected the deeper schisms that had torn the Night's Watch apart, creating divisions that seemed impossible to bridge through negotiation or compromise. Davos and his small band of loyalists barricaded themselves in the Lord Commander's quarters, using furniture and supplies to create makeshift fortifications that could delay but not prevent an assault by superior numbers. The knowledge that Thorne's supporters controlled the castle's armory and food supplies made their position increasingly desperate, yet none were willing to surrender Jon's corpse to men who would likely desecrate it in victory. Ghost's presence added an element of supernatural menace to the already tense situation, the massive direwolf's red eyes promising violence that would extract a terrible price from anyone who approached his dead master with hostile intent. The albino wolf had grown to enormous size during his time at Castle Black, his pure white coat and silent movements making him seem more spirit than flesh to brothers already unnerved by recent events. His obvious grief and rage created an atmosphere of barely controlled savagery that made even the boldest conspirators reluctant to press their advantage too aggressively. Melisandre's examination of Jon's body revealed details that escaped the notice of men whose understanding of death was limited to purely physical considerations. The Red Priestess, recognizing signs that spoke of possibilities beyond ordinary human experience. Her fingers traced wounds that should have been instantly fatal, noting the precise placement and clean edges that suggested careful planning rather than frenzied violence. The ritual aspects of the assassination, from the symbolic sign to the shared responsibility among multiple killers, indicated beliefs about purification and sacrifice that transcended mere political assassination to become something approaching religious ceremony. The revelation of Jon's true nature came through visions that bypassed rational thought to speak directly to the priestess's supernatural understanding, images of ice and fire that revealed destinies written in languages older than human speech. Melisandre saw in the corpse before her not merely another dead hero, but a convergence of prophecies that had shaped her entire life's work. The prince that was promised lying murdered by those he had died trying to protect. The irony was bitter beyond measure. Yet it also suggested possibilities for redemption that death itself could not prevent if the proper rituals were observed and the necessary prices paid. The decision to attempt resurrection required Melisandre to confront her own crisis of faith, the failures at Winterfell having shattered confidence in abilities and beliefs that had sustained her through centuries of service to R'hllor. Her magic had proven inadequate to save Stannis Baratheon from defeat and death, while her visions had led her to counsel actions that resulted in the burning of an innocent child. The prospect of attempting to restore life to one who had been so brutally murdered seemed to demand powers that she was no longer certain she possessed, yet the alternative was to abandon hope entirely and accept that darkness had triumphed over light. Davos Seaworth's desperate plea for the priestess's intervention came from a man whose faith in magic remained limited, despite having witnessed its effects firsthand, yet whose practical nature recognized that conventional solutions were inadequate to address their current crisis. The smuggler had seen enough of Melisandre's abilities to believe that resurrection was possible, even if he could not begin to understand the forces and prices involved in such an undertaking. His arguments focused on necessity rather than theology, pointing out that Jon's return would solve immediate problems of leadership and legitimacy, while providing hope for the future defense of the realm. The ritual itself combined elements from traditions that predated written history, drawing upon knowledge that Melisandre had gathered during centuries of study and service in lands where the boundaries between life and death remained fluid. She cleansed Jon's wounds with water that had been blessed according to ancient formulas, her movements precise and deliberate as she prepared the corpse for what was to come. The cutting of his hair and beard followed patterns that spoke of sacrifice and renewal, while the burning of these offerings released energies that had been building since the moment of his death. The words of power that Melisandre chanted in High Valyrian carried meanings that transcended their literal translation, invoking forces and authorities that most men could not even imagine existed. Her voice grew stronger as the ritual progressed, confidence returning as she felt the familiar stirring of power that had sustained her through centuries of service to the Lord of Light. The flames on the brazier danced higher with each phrase, their light seeming to penetrate the very substance of Jon's flesh, as if seeking something hidden within the cooling meat and stiffening bones. The failure of the initial attempt struck those present like a physical blow, hope draining from the room as quickly as warmth fled from an open door in winter. Melisandre's exhaustion was evident in every line of her body, the effort of channeling such power having drained reserves that centuries of experience had taught her to husband carefully. Tormund's cursing filled the silence that followed, the wildling's grief finding expression in profanity that would have impressed seasoned soldiers, while Davos maintained the stoic acceptance of disappointment that had carried him through a lifetime of setbacks and reversals. The departure of the witnesses from Jon's chamber reflected the crushing weight of defeat, each person carrying away their own burden of shattered hopes and unfulfilled promises. The Red Priestess remained beside the corpse longer than the others, her fingers continuing to trace patterns on his chest, as if unwilling to accept that her powers were insufficient to reverse what had been done. The whispered prayers that escaped her lips carried more desperation than confidence, final attempts to reach powers that seemed to have abandoned her in her moment of greatest need. Ghost's vigil beside his master's body took on aspects of religious devotion. The great direwolf, maintaining a watch that transcended ordinary animal loyalty to become something approaching sacred duty. His red eyes never left Jon's face, as if the intensity of his gaze alone might somehow call back the soul that had departed when the conspirators' knives found their marks. The connection between them had always been profound, deeper than the bonds that typically existed between men and their companions, and now it seemed that even death could not entirely sever ties forged in something stronger than mere affection. The moment of return came without fanfare or obvious supernatural manifestation, Jon's eyes simply opening to stare at the wooden ceiling, as if he had merely awakened from ordinary sleep rather than returning from whatever lay beyond the threshold of mortality. His first breath was deep and gasping, filling lungs that had been still for hours with air that seemed almost too rich and vibrant after the emptiness of death. The wounds that had killed him remained visible, but no longer bled, healed sufficiently to sustain life, yet still bearing witness to the violence that had ended his first existence. The reunion between Jon and his supporters carried emotional weight that transcended mere relief at his survival, touching upon questions of faith and meaning that had been severely tested during the dark hours of his absence. Davos's practical nature led him to focus on immediate concerns about Jon's physical condition and mental state, checking for signs of injury or confusion that might indicate incomplete healing. Tormund's joy expressed itself in the rough affection typical of wildling culture, though even his celebration was tempered by awareness that resurrection carried prices and consequences that remained to be discovered. The changes that death had wrought in Jon's character became apparent through subtle alterations in manner and perspective that spoke of experiences beyond ordinary human understanding. His responses to questions carried a thoughtful quality that had not been present before, as if he were examining each word for meanings that others could not perceive. The easy humor that had once characterized his interactions with friends and subordinates had been replaced by a gravity that seemed almost oppressive in its weight. Yet there was also a sense of purpose that transcended his previous dedication to duty and honor. The justice that Jon dispensed to his murderers reflected both his changed nature and the harsh necessities imposed by command in an organization where mutiny could not be tolerated, regardless of its supposed justifications. The executions were carried out with mechanical precision that spoke more of duty than anger, each conspirator meeting death with whatever dignity they could muster in the face of consequences they had surely known awaited them if their coup failed. Ollie's youth made his execution particularly poignant, yet Jon's expression showed no wavering in his resolve to see justice done, regardless of personal feelings or regrets about the boy's tragic path from hero to traitor. The decision to abandon his position as Lord Commander came not from bitterness or desire for revenge, but from the profound understanding that death had severed bonds that could not be renewed through mere resurrection. Jon's vows to the Night's Watch had been fulfilled in the most literal sense possible, his life given in service to the organization that had shaped him from boy to man to leader. The technicality that death released him from oaths sworn for life provided legal justification for departure, yet the deeper truth was that the man who had been murdered was not entirely the same as the one who had returned to face a world that seemed alien despite its familiar appearances. The arrival of Sansa Stark at Castle Black created a moment of pure joy that penetrated the darkness that had settled over Jon's spirit since his return from death. The reunion between siblings, providing hope for healing that transcended the supernatural circumstances of his resurrection. Their embrace carried the weight of shared sorrows and separate ordeals, each recognizing in the other someone who had been fundamentally changed by experiences that few could understand or appreciate. The tears they shed were for losses that went beyond simple grief to encompass the death of innocence and the burden of knowledge that could never be forgotten or set aside. The conversation between Jon and Sansa revealed depths of mutual understanding that had been impossible during their childhood at Winterfell, when differences in age and interests had kept them from forming the close bonds that connected other siblings. The sufferings each had endured had stripped away superficial concerns about legitimacy and social status, replacing them with recognition of essential qualities that transcended the accidents of birth. Sansa's regret for her childhood coldness toward her half-brother carried genuine weight, while Jon's easy forgiveness demonstrated the larger perspective that resurrection had granted him. Ramsay Bolton's letter demanding Sansa's return and threatening unspeakable cruelties transformed what might have remained a private family reunion into a call to arms that could not be ignored by anyone with honor or humanity. The detailed descriptions of torments that awaited not only Sansa but Jon himself revealed a mind so twisted by evil that negotiation or compromise was impossible. The threats against Rickon added urgency that transcended personal considerations to encompass family obligations that demanded response regardless of the odds or likely outcomes of military confrontation. The decision to march against the Boltons represented Jon's first major choice as someone freed from the constraints of Night's Watch vows, yet it also demonstrated that his fundamental nature remained unchanged, despite the transformative experience of death and resurrection. His commitment to protecting family and defending the innocent required no oath or external authority to validate it, arising instead from core values that defined his identity more completely than any title or position. The prospect of reclaiming Winterfell for House Stark provided purpose that gave meaning to his unlikely return to life, suggesting that resurrection had been granted for reasons that extended beyond personal survival. The campaign to gather support for their cause revealed the complex political realities that had emerged in the North during the years of war and instability that followed Ned Stark's execution in King's Landing. Many houses that had once sworn loyalty to Winterfell now found themselves bound by pragmatic considerations that made open rebellion against the Boltons seem like suicidal folly. The careful calculation of risks and benefits that characterized these negotiations demonstrated how thoroughly the ideals of honor and loyalty had been compromised by the harsh necessities of survival in a world where backing the wrong cause meant extinction for entire bloodlines. Lyanna Mormont's fierce loyalty to Jon's cause, despite his bastard status, provided one of the few bright moments in a recruitment effort that met with disappointing results from most potential allies. The young lady's passionate defense of Jon's worthiness to lead carried moral authority that transcended her house's modest military resources, reminding all present that true nobility derived from character rather than circumstances of birth. Her promise that each Mormont soldier would fight with the worth of 10 men proved prophetic, as the small contingent her house provided would distinguish themselves through courage and skill that more than compensated for their limited numbers. The mathematical reality of their military situation made victory seem impossible when viewed through conventional strategic analysis, with Ramsay's forces outnumbering their ragtag army by margins that should have guaranteed defeat, regardless of individual courage or tactical brilliance. Jon's willingness to proceed despite these overwhelming odds reflected both his commitment to family duty and the changed perspective that resurrection had granted him about the relative importance of life and death. The acceptance of likely martyrdom carried elements of both nobility and tragedy, suggesting that his return to life might be destined to end in a second and more final death. The battle itself would test every lesson that Jon had learned about leadership and warfare during his service with the Night's Watch, forcing him to balance strategic thinking against emotional impulses that threatened to overwhelm rational judgment. The presence of his youngest brother Rickon on the opposing side added personal stakes that made objective assessment of tactical situations nearly impossible, while the memory of his own resurrection provided both confidence and recklessness about facing death in combat. The outcome would determine not merely the fate of House Stark, but the future of the North itself, with consequences that would echo through the remaining conflicts that lay ahead. The Battle of the Bastards erupted with all the chaotic fury that marked the greatest conflicts in Westerosi history, transforming the fields outside Winterfell into a hellscape, where valor and desperation clashed with equal intensity. Rickon Stark's death beneath a rain of arrows served as the opening movement in this symphony of violence, his young life ending just beyond Jon's desperate reach, in a moment that crystallized all the cruelty and injustice that had plagued House Stark since their father's execution. The sight of his youngest brother's body pierced with Ramsay's final shot ignited something primal within Jon, transforming careful military strategy into raw, emotional fury that nearly cost him everything he had fought so hard to reclaim. The cavalry charge that followed Rickon's murder became an epic of brotherhood and sacrifice, with loyal northern houses and wildling warriors riding to certain death rather than abandon their chosen leader to face overwhelming odds alone. Horses and men crashed together in thunderous collision that shook the very ground, while the clash of steel on steel created a din that could be heard for miles across the winter landscape. Jon's survival through the initial melee owed more to the protective instincts of his followers than to his own tactical brilliance, their willingness to die for someone they barely knew, speaking to qualities of leadership that transcended mere nobility of birth. The encirclement that followed trapped Jon's forces in a steadily contracting ring of Bolton spears, creating conditions that transformed brave warriors into panicked animals, fighting desperately for space to breathe and swing their weapons. The press of bodies became so intense that men died not from enemy steel but from suffocation, their lungs crushed by the weight of their own comrades pushed against them by the inexorable advance of Ramsay's disciplined infantry. Jon found himself buried beneath layers of the living and the dead, experiencing a claustrophobic terror that made his resurrection from the cold peace of death seem preferable to this hot chaos of failing flesh and desperate gasps for air. The arrival of Pettier Baelish and the Knights of the Vale transformed certain defeat into glorious victory, through timing so perfect that it seemed ordained by the gods themselves, their heavy cavalry smashing into Bolton flanks with devastating effect that scattered disciplined formations like leaves before a hurricane. Sansa's secret negotiations with Littlefinger had provided the margin of survival that Jon's honor had been too proud to seek, demonstrating once again that survival sometimes required compromises with morally questionable allies. The sight of the falcon banners streaming across the battlefield brought tears of relief to men who had already composed themselves for death, while the thundering hooves of armored destroyers announced that the tide of battle had turned decisively in favor of the righteous. The siege of Winterfell's walls lasted only long enough for Wun the giant to demonstrate why such creatures had become legends among both wildlings and southerners, his massive strength reducing ancient gates to splinters, despite the arrows that filled his enormous body like porcupine quills. The giant's sacrifice opened the path to victory while providing a final demonstration of the loyalty that Jon's leadership had earned among the most unlikely allies, his death ensuring that the Stark banner would once again fly over the castle that had been home to his ancestors for thousands of years. The breach in Winterfell's defenses marked the end of Bolton rule and the beginning of a restoration that would echo throughout the Seven Kingdoms. Ramsay Bolton's final confrontation with Jon took place in the very courtyard, where both had learned the lessons of violence and power, yet their approaches to warfare revealed fundamental differences in character that no amount of tactical skill could overcome. The bastard of the Dreadfort fought with the desperate cunning of a cornered animal, using every advantage that position and equipment could provide, while showing no concern for honor or fair play. Jon's response demonstrated the controlled fury of someone who had learned to channel rage into effective action, his systematic destruction of Ramsay's defenses serving as both personal vengeance and symbolic justice for the countless innocents who had suffered under Bolton rule. The temptation to beat his enemy to death with his bare hands nearly overcame Jon's better judgment, the savage satisfaction of inflicting pain on someone who had caused so much suffering, proving almost irresistible in the heat of victory. Only Sansa's presence prevented him from completing an act of revenge that would have stained his honor while providing the cathartic release that his traumatized spirit desperately craved. The restraint he showed in that crucial moment demonstrated growth in wisdom and self-control that death and resurrection had somehow strengthened rather than weakened, marking him as someone capable of mercy, even toward those who least deserved such consideration. The restoration of Stark rule to Winterfell carried symbolic weight that extended far beyond the immediate tactical advantages of controlling the North's ancient seat of power, representing the return of justice and honor to lands that had suffered under the arbitrary cruelties imposed by illegitimate usurpers. The great hall that had once echoed with the laughter of Ned Stark's children now witnessed the assembly of northern lords who had survived years of warfare and betrayal, their faces bearing the marks of experiences that had tested their loyalty to breaking points. The banners that hung from the rafters told stories of houses that had endured despite losses that would have destroyed lesser bloodlines, their continued existence serving as testimony to the resilience that defined northern character. Jon's reluctance to assume lordship over Winterfell reflected both his continued uncertainty about his proper place in the world and his genuine respect for Sansa's superior claim to their ancestral home through the accident of legitimate birth. His offer to serve as her bannerman rather than her lord demonstrated humility that impressed even those who might have preferred more conventional approaches to questions of inheritance and authority. The conversation between them revealed depths of mutual respect and understanding that had grown from their shared ordeals, replacing childhood tensions with adult appreciation for qualities that complemented their different strengths and perspectives. The revelation of his acclamation as king in the North came as a complete surprise to Jon, whose expectations had been limited to serving his family's interests rather than assuming leadership of an entire kingdom that had suffered through years of division and defeat. Lyanna Mormont's passionate speech about the irrelevance of bastard status when weighed against demonstrated courage and competence carried the emotional authority that swayed hearts and minds throughout the assembled crowd. Her declaration that Jon was a Stark in all the ways that truly mattered challenged assumptions about legitimacy that had constrained thinking about leadership for generations, opening possibilities for merit-based advancement that transcended the accidents of birth. The unanimous acclamation that followed transformed the Great Hall into a scene of celebration that had not been witnessed since before the War of the Five Kings had torn the realm apart through competing claims and bitter rivalries. Lords who had been enemies only hours before found themselves united in recognition of someone whose character and achievements transcended the political calculations that normally governed such decisions. The drawn swords that saluted their new king reflected not merely feudal obligation, but genuine enthusiasm for a leader whose proven courage and integrity offered hope for better times ahead. The crown that settled upon Jon's brow carried the weight of 8,000 years of Stark rule, connecting him to a legacy that stretched back to the legendary Brandon the Builder and the earliest days of human civilization in the north. The responsibility that came with kingship represented a burden that his reluctant nature found almost overwhelming, yet the trust that his bannermen had placed in him demanded acceptance, regardless of personal preferences or doubts about his worthiness. The cheers that echoed through Winterfell's ancient halls marked not merely the restoration of House Stark, but the beginning of a new chapter in Northern history that would be written by someone who had never expected to hold such power. The transition from bastard to king required Jon to master skills and perspectives that no amount of Night's Watch training could have provided, forcing him to think in terms of kingdoms rather than castles, and generations rather than seasons. The administrative challenges of ruling a war-torn realm demanded attention to details that ranged from tax collection and grain storage to the complex negotiations required to heal wounds between houses that had fought on opposing sides during recent conflicts. His natural inclination toward justice and fairness provided moral guidance. Yet the practical realities of governance often required compromises that tested his principles against the needs of the many. The invitation from Dragonstone arrived at a moment when Jon's grasp on power remained tenuous, despite the enthusiastic support he had received from the assembled northern lords. His kingdom's resources depleted by years of warfare and his military strength insufficient to resist determined invasion from south or east. Daenerys Targaryen's message carried implications that extended far beyond diplomatic courtesy, representing both opportunity for crucial alliance and potential threat to the independence that the North had fought so hard to reclaim. The decision of whether to accept her invitation would determine not merely his own fate, but the future relationship between two claimants whose competing visions of justice and authority seemed difficult to reconcile. Samwell Tarly's letter about the dragonglass deposits beneath Dragonstone added practical urgency to what might otherwise have remained purely political considerations, providing justification for risks that mere diplomacy could not have warranted given the precarious state of northern defenses. The revelation that weapons capable of destroying White Walkers existed in quantities sufficient to arm entire armies transformed the strategic equation entirely, making alliance with their possessor essential regardless of personal costs or political complications. The knowledge that ancient enemies were stirring beyond the wall gave Jon's decision additional weight, connecting immediate diplomatic needs to the ultimate survival of humanity itself. The journey south to Dragonstone carried Jon away from the secure, familiar environment of the North into political waters that were far more treacherous than any physical dangers he had faced during his time beyond the Wall or his service. With the Night's Watch, the ship that bore him toward his meeting with the Dragon Queen also carried the hopes and fears of subjects who had entrusted their newly won independence to someone whose diplomatic skills remained largely untested. The conversations with Davos during their voyage revealed the complexities of negotiating with someone whose power derived from conquest rather than inheritance, requiring approaches that balanced strength with pragmatism. The approach to Dragonstone revealed the awesome power that Daenerys commanded through her dragons, creatures whose very existence challenged every assumption about the balance of forces that had previously governed military thinking throughout Westeros. The ancient Targaryen stronghold rose from the narrow sea like a monument to vanished glories, its dragon-carved walls speaking of powers that had once united 7 kingdoms under a single crown through fire and blood. The sight of actual dragons circling the castle's towers transformed legend into reality, with casual indifference to the shock and awe such creatures inspired in those who had never witnessed living magic. The formal introduction between Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen carried weight that transcended immediate political considerations, bringing together two individuals whose destinies had been shaped by forces neither fully understood, yet both had learned to navigate through instinct and determination rather than formal preparation. Missandei's recitation of Daenerys's titles and achievements served to establish the Dragon Queen's credentials, while subtly emphasizing the vast difference in apparent status between a queen who commanded dragons and armies, spanning continents, and a bastard king whose realm consisted of a single war-torn kingdom. Jon's simple introduction as king in the north provided deliberate contrast that emphasized substance over ceremony, character over conquest. The negotiations that followed revealed fundamental differences in worldview that made immediate alliance difficult despite the mutual respect that developed between two leaders who recognized similar qualities of determination and integrity in each other. Daenerys's expectation that Jon would bend the knee reflected her assumption that strength naturally commanded submission, while his refusal demonstrated northern independence that had been purchased with blood too recently spilled to be casually surrendered. Their debate about the relevance of ancient oaths and the legitimacy of inherited authority touched upon questions of political philosophy that had shaped conflicts throughout Westerosi history. The revelation of the true threat posed by the army of the dead transformed their diplomatic dance into something approaching religious revelation. As Daenerys confronted evidence of supernatural dangers that her dragons and armies were unprepared to face despite their dominance over conventional military forces. Jon's descriptions of White Walkers and their white servants challenged her understanding of the world in ways that political opposition never could, introducing variables that made her conquest of the Iron Throne seem almost irrelevant compared to the species-level extinction that threatened all human life. The dragon-glass mine that Sam had discovered provided both the excuse for extended negotiation and the practical foundation for cooperation that transcended their political disagreements. The ancient cave paintings that Jon showed Daenerys beneath Dragonstone revealed truths about the past that neither had suspected, demonstrating that the current crisis was merely the latest chapter in a conflict that had shaped human history since the earliest days of settlement in Westeros. The images of children of the forest and first men working together against the common threat of the others provided precedent for the alliance that Jon sought, showing that survival had once required cooperation between peoples who had previously been enemies. The artistic record of ancient victories offered hope that the current threat could be defeated, yet also warned of the prices that such victory would demand from those who dared to resist the darkness. The growing attraction between Jon and Daenerys developed despite the political complications that such feelings created, their shared experiences of leadership and loss creating bonds that transcended the superficial differences in their backgrounds and current circumstances. Their conversations revealed similarities in character that neither had expected to find, including the burden of unwanted power and the loneliness that came with making decisions that affected the lives of thousands. The recognition that each had sacrificed personal happiness in service of larger causes created intimacy that was both dangerous and irresistible, threatening to complicate negotiations that required clear thinking about competing interests and obligations. The mission beyond the wall to capture a white represented Jon's most desperate gamble yet, staking everything on a plan that required surviving encounters with enemies whose supernatural nature made conventional tactical thinking obsolete, while hoping that proof of the threat would convince skeptics whose resistance to alliance was based more on political calculation than genuine doubt about the evidence he had provided. The expedition that he assembled included some of the most capable fighters in Westeros, yet their combined skills seemed pitifully inadequate when measured against the power that the Night King commanded through his army of the undead and the eternal winter that followed in his wake. The return to Winterfell brought with it an entourage that would have seemed impossible only months before, as dragons cast their shadows over the ancient seat of House Stark, while Dothraki warriors rode alongside northern knights in a display of unity that transcended every boundary of culture and tradition that had previously divided the known world. The small folk of the winter town gathered in awed silence to witness creatures of legend made flesh, their massive wings blotting out the pale northern sun as they circled the castle towers with lazy grace that belied their terrible power. Jon's homecoming as king in the north was overshadowed by the presence of Daenerys Targaryen, whose silver hair and violet eyes marked her as something foreign and potentially dangerous despite the alliance that had brought her armies to defend his kingdom. Sansa Stark's reception of her supposed half-brother's new queen carried undertones of suspicion and political calculation that years of surviving among enemies had taught her to disguise behind the courtesy expected of noble ladies welcoming honored guests. The Lady of Winterfell had learned hard lessons about the difference between personal affection and political necessity during her ordeals at King's Landing and the Vale, understanding that even the most genuine emotions could become weapons in the hands of those skilled enough to manipulate them. Her assessment of Daenerys revealed a mind sharpened by trauma into something approaching tactical brilliance, recognizing threats and opportunities with clarity that her sheltered childhood could never have provided. The Great Hall of Winterfell had witnessed countless momentous gatherings throughout its 8,000-year history, yet few could match the significance of the assembly that convened to plan the defense of the living against the army of the dead. Lords and ladies who had spent years fighting each other now found themselves united by necessity against an enemy that recognized no distinction between friend and foe, conqueror and conquered, noble and common. The maps spread across the ancient oak tables showed dispositions of forces that represented the greatest military alliance in recorded history, yet even these impressive numbers seemed inadequate when measured against the supernatural threat that approached from beyond the wall. Daenerys's dragons provided both hope and complication for the defensive preparations, their presence offering capabilities that no conventional military force could match, while also creating coordination challenges that tested the limits of human tactical thinking. Drogon and Rhaegal responded to their mother's commands with intelligence that approached the human, yet their alien nature made them difficult to integrate into battle plans that had been developed for terrestrial forces operating according to predictable limitations. The sight of Jon riding Rhaegal above the winter landscape provided symbolic confirmation of the alliance between ice and fire, though the deeper implications of the dragon's acceptance of a rider who lacked Targaryen blood remained mysterious to all who witnessed it. The crypts of Winterfell became a refuge for those too young or old to fight, their ancient stones offering protection that seemed more psychological than practical given the nature of the enemy they faced. The irony of seeking safety among the dead while fighting creatures that raised corpses as weapons was not lost on those who made the descent into the underground chambers where generations of Stark lords lay in eternal rest. Lyanna Stark's tomb drew particular attention from visitors who recognized the tragedy that her stone effigy represented, the young woman whose beauty and spirit had sparked a war that reshaped the Seven Kingdoms lying in death beside the brother who had died trying to rescue her. The revelation of Jon's true parentage to the woman he had come to love created complications that transcended mere political considerations to touch upon fundamental questions of identity, destiny, and the role that blood played in determining worthiness to rule. Samwell Tarly's careful explanation of the evidence gathered from ancient texts and Bran Stark's supernatural confirmation through Greensight left no room for doubt about facts that challenged every assumption Jon had formed about his place in the world. The knowledge that he was not Ned Stark's bastard but rather the legitimate son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark transformed him from a noble bastard into the rightful heir to the Iron Throne, yet this elevation in status brought burdens that seemed to outweigh any benefits. Daenerys' reaction to learning that her lover was also her nephew and potential rival for the crown she had spent her entire life trying to claim revealed depths of character that even she had not fully understood before confronting this ultimate test of her motivations and priorities. The political implications were staggering, as Jon's superior claim to the throne could undermine everything she had accomplished through years of conquest and liberation across Essos and Westeros. Yet the personal dimensions of the revelation proved even more challenging, forcing her to reconcile genuine affection for Jon with the dynastic ambitions that had driven her across the narrow sea to reclaim her family's birthright. The Night King's assault on Winterfell began with supernatural silence that was more terrifying than any war cry or battle horn, the army of the dead advancing through the winter darkness with inexorable patience that spoke of absolute confidence in their ultimate victory. The sight of countless whites shambling across the snow-covered fields surrounding the castle created a spectacle that challenged the sanity of even veteran warriors who had witnessed every conceivable form of human violence during their careers. The absence of fear or hesitation in the enemy ranks was perhaps most unsettling of all. Their single-minded focus on destruction, making negotiation or retreat equally impossible for the living forces arrayed against them. The battle itself defied every convention of warfare that military commanders had developed over centuries of human conflict. Pitting the courage and tactical brilliance of mortal soldiers against supernatural enemies who felt neither pain nor fear while possessing strength that exceeded human limitations by enormous margins. The carefully planned defensive positions that had been established around Winterfell's walls proved inadequate against foes who could scale vertical surfaces with the agility of spiders, while showing complete indifference to conventional weapons that would have devastated living opponents. The sight of dead Stark ancestors rising from their crypts to attack the very family they had sworn to protect in life provided a final demonstration of the enemy's power to corrupt even the most sacred bonds of loyalty and honor. Jon's personal combat with Whites and White Walkers throughout the battle demonstrated both the skills he had acquired during years of training and the limitations that mortality imposed even upon the most capable warriors when facing supernatural opponents. Longclaw's Valyrian steel blade proved invaluable in destroying enemies that conventional weapons could barely scratch. Yet each victory came at enormous cost in energy and endurance that could not be sustained indefinitely against unlimited numbers of foes. The moment when he found himself face to face with the Night King represented the culmination of conflicts that had been building since his first encounter with the others beyond the wall. Yet their confrontation was interrupted by events that no one could have anticipated. Arya Stark's assassination of the Night King provided a resolution to the battle that was both completely unexpected and thoroughly satisfying, demonstrating that heroism could take forms that transcended conventional notions of martial prowess and noble sacrifice. Her years of training with the Faceless Men had prepared her for precisely this type of mission, requiring stealth and precision rather than the straightforward courage that her brother and his allies had displayed throughout the fighting. The moment when her Valyrian steel dagger penetrated the Night King's armor marked not merely the end of a battle, but the conclusion of a threat that had haunted human civilization since the Long Night. Yet victory brought its own complications and unforeseen consequences. The aftermath of the battle revealed the true cost of victory against supernatural enemies, with casualty rates that would have been considered catastrophic even by the brutal standards of the War of the Five Kings. The Great Hall of Winterfell became a morgue filled with the bodies of heroes who had given their lives to protect the future of human civilization, their sacrifice honored by survivors who understood how narrowly they had escaped extinction. The funeral pyres that burned throughout the following days consumed not merely flesh and bone, but dreams and hopes that had died alongside the fallen, leaving the living to contemplate a world that seemed somehow diminished despite their triumph over ancient evil. Daenerys's growing isolation in the aftermath of victory reflected both her status as a foreign conqueror among people who had never asked for her protection, and the psychological toll that losing so many of her closest advisors and friends had exacted upon her mental stability. The death of Jorah Mormont deprived her of the unwavering loyalty that had sustained her through years of struggle and adversity, while the loss of so many Dothraki and unsullied warriors reduced her military strength to levels that made the conquest of King's Landing seem increasingly uncertain. The celebration feast that followed the battle became a torture session for someone who found herself surrounded by people who viewed her as an outsider, despite her crucial role in their survival. The decision to proceed with the campaign against Cersei Lannister, despite the enormous losses suffered at Winterfell, reflected both strategic necessity and psychological need for Daenerys to reclaim the sense of purpose and destiny that the revelation of Jon's parentage had severely undermined. The Iron Throne represented more than political power to someone who had spent her entire adult life believing that royal blood carried with it both the right and obligation to rule, making retreat or compromise impossible regardless of practical considerations about military strength or popular support. The march south toward King's Landing became a race between external enemies and internal demons, with the fate of the Seven Kingdoms hanging in the balance. The naval battle that cost Daenerys her dragon Rhaegal provided a crushing demonstration of how quickly fortune could shift in warfare, transforming apparent advantage into devastating loss through a combination of tactical surprise and technological superiority that her forces had not anticipated. Euron Greyjoy's Scorpion Ballistae proved capable of inflicting mortal wounds upon creatures that had previously seemed invulnerable to conventional weapons, while his fleet's mobility allowed them to strike without warning before withdrawing beyond the range of retaliation. The sight of Rhaegal plummeting into the narrow sea marked another step in Daenerys' psychological descent, stripping away one of the primary sources of her power while eliminating a crucial advantage for the coming siege. The final approach to King's Landing revealed a city that had been transformed into a fortress, designed to maximize civilian casualties while minimizing the effectiveness of dragon-based assault. With Scorpion installations positioned throughout the urban landscape, and innocents concentrated in areas where their deaths would be inevitable if Daenerys chose to employ her remaining dragon against military targets. Cersei Lannister's strategy represented the culmination of a lifetime spent using cruelty and manipulation as weapons, creating situations where any choice her enemies made would result in atrocities that could be blamed upon their moral failings rather than her own machinations. The bells of surrender that rang across the city should have marked the end of hostilities. Yet they became instead the trigger for the greatest tragedy in King's Landing's long and often bloody history. Daenerys' decision to continue her assault, despite the city's surrender, reflected the complete breakdown of rational judgment under pressures that had been building throughout her campaign to claim her birthright, transforming a liberator into a tyrant through a process of psychological collapse that horrified even those who had supported her cause. The systematic destruction of neighborhoods filled with innocent civilians represented the final evolution of someone who had begun her journey with genuine desire to break chains and free the oppressed, but had gradually come to see resistance to her rule as evidence of corruption that required purification through fire. The sight of Drogon's flames consuming surrendered soldiers and fleeing children alike marked the moment when the Dragon Queen became indistinguishable from the Mad King whose throne she had claimed. Jon's horror at witnessing the atrocities committed in his name as Daenerys' lover and ally created internal conflicts that challenged his fundamental understanding of duty, honor, and the proper limits of violence in pursuit of justice. His attempts to restrain his own forces from participating in the massacre demonstrated the moral clarity that had always characterized his leadership, yet his inability to prevent the broader catastrophe filled him with guilt and self-doubt that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The burning of King's Landing represented not merely a military victory, but a moral defeat that tainted everyone associated with it, transforming what should have been liberation into something approaching genocide. The aftermath of the destruction revealed the full scope of the tragedy that unchecked power could inflict when guided by someone who had lost the ability to distinguish between justice and vengeance, liberation and conquest. The charred remains of innocent men, women, and children filled streets that had once bustled with the ordinary activities of daily life, while the acrid smoke of burning flesh created clouds that blocked out the sun for days after the flames had finally died. The silence that settled over the devastated city was broken only by the cries of survivors searching for family members who would never be found, their voices carrying grief that seemed to embody the collective trauma of an entire civilization. Tyrion Lannister's arrest for treason provided a final demonstration of how completely Daenerys had abandoned the principles of justice and mercy that had once characterized her rule, replacing them with paranoia and vindictiveness that brooked no opposition or dissent from even her most loyal advisors. His crime had been attempting to prevent unnecessary bloodshed through diplomatic means. Yet in her twisted worldview, this represented betrayal of her divine mission to cleanse the world of corruption through fire and blood. The casual manner in which she discarded someone who had served her faithfully for years revealed the depth of her moral collapse, showing that no one could consider themselves safe from her wrath. Once rationality had been replaced by messianic delusion. The confrontation between Jon and Daenerys in the ruins of the Iron Throne Room became the final test of everything he had learned about love, duty, and the sometimes terrible prices that honor demanded from those who chose to serve causes greater than themselves. Her continued justification of atrocities that had shocked even hardened warriors demonstrated how completely she had lost touch with basic human decency, while her plans for expanding such methods to the rest of the world made clear that King's Landing was merely the beginning of horrors that would continue until someone found the courage to stop her. The throne room itself seemed to mock the very concept of just rule, its melted ruins serving as testimony to the futility of seeking power through violence and intimidation. The kiss that preceded Jon's assassination of Daenerys carried all the tragedy of genuine love, destroyed by irreconcilable differences about the nature of justice and the proper use of power, their final embrace serving as both farewell and forgiveness for crimes that neither could prevent or overlook. The blade that pierced her heart ended not merely a life, but a dream of liberation that had inspired millions across 2 continents, yet had somehow transformed into a nightmare of oppression that threatened to consume everything it had originally sought to protect. The tears that Jon shed over her body reflected grief not only for the woman he had loved, but for the ideals they had shared before. Power and trauma had corrupted them beyond recognition or redemption. Drogon's response to his mother's death demonstrated intelligence and emotional depth that transcended animal instinct. The great dragon's recognition that the Iron Throne itself bore responsibility for the corruption of his rider, leading him to destroy the symbol that had caused so much suffering throughout the history of the Seven Kingdoms. His decision to spare Jon despite witnessing the assassination suggested understanding of motivations and necessities that purely vengeful reactions could not have encompassed, while his departure with Daenerys's body provided a conclusion to the Targaryen dynasty that was both majestic and final. The melting of the throne marked the end of an era in Westerosi history, destroying forever the symbol that had driven so many to commit atrocities in pursuit of ultimate power. The Great Council, that convened to determine the future of the Seven Kingdoms, brought together survivors of conflicts that had shaped an entire generation, their collective wisdom earned through experiences that no amount of formal education could have provided. The selection of Bran Stark as king represented a radical departure from traditional notions of inheritance and political legitimacy, choosing someone whose supernatural abilities and apparent lack of personal ambition made him uniquely qualified to heal wounds that conventional rulers had only deepened. His acceptance of the crown marked not merely a personal transformation from broken boy to philosopher king, but a fundamental shift in the nature of royal authority from conquest to service. Jon's exile to the Night's Watch provided a resolution to his story that was both punishment and mercy, removing him from political considerations that his very existence had complicated, while allowing him to return to the life of service that had always suited his temperament better than the responsibilities of kingship. The irony of his banishment to an organization that had been largely abandoned and forgotten was not lost on anyone present, yet it offered possibilities for redemption and purpose that mere execution could never have provided. The journey north toward Castle Black became a pilgrimage toward understanding, carrying him away from the complexities of Southern politics toward the simpler truths that he had discovered during his earlier service beyond the Wall. The journey north from King's Landing carried Jon Snow toward a destiny that seemed both familiar and utterly transformed, each mile bringing him closer to lands where the complications of Southern politics could not follow, and where the simple truths of survival and service might provide redemption for sins that weighed heavier than any crown. The Black brothers who escorted him maintained respectful silence throughout their travel, understanding that their companion bore burdens that mere words could never address or alleviate. The landscape itself seemed to welcome his return, the familiar sights and sounds of the north, offering comfort that no throne room or palace could have provided to someone whose soul had been shaped by ice and honor rather than fire and ambition. Castle Black rose from the southern face of the wall like a monument to forgotten purposes, its ancient stones weathered by centuries of service yet still standing firm against the eternal winter that pressed down from the lands beyond. The Great Barrier itself stretched endlessly in both directions, its icy ramparts gleaming in the pale sunlight with a beauty that belied the grim necessities that had demanded its construction 8,000 years before. The sight of that massive fortification brought memories flooding back of his first arrival as a green boy seeking purpose and belonging, though the man who now approached bore scars both visible and hidden that marked him as someone fundamentally changed by experiences that few could comprehend or survive. The reunion with Tormund Giantsbane and the surviving wildlings provided one of the few moments of genuine joy that Jon had experienced since the horrors of King's Landing had shattered his faith in the possibility of just rule and righteous conquest. The red-bearded warrior's embrace carried the warmth of friendship that transcended the artificial boundaries between civilized men and free folk, acknowledging bonds forged in shared danger and mutual respect, rather than the calculations of political advantage that had poisoned so many relationships in the world south of the Wall. Their conversation revealed the simple truths that Jon had almost forgotten during his time among kings and queens, reminders that honor and loyalty could exist without the corruption that seemed inevitable when power grew too great for human wisdom to properly control. Ghost's presence at his master's side completed a reunion that touched upon something deeper than mere affection between man and beast, representing the restoration of connections that death itself had failed to sever completely. The great direwolf's red eyes held intelligence that seemed almost human in its understanding of the pain and guilt that haunted Jon's every waking moment, offering silent companionship that required no explanations or justifications for choices that necessity had demanded but honor had made nearly unbearable. The bond between them had survived separation, betrayal, and even resurrection, proving that some relationships possessed strength that transcended the ordinary limitations of mortality and circumstance. The decision to venture beyond the Wall with the remaining free folk represented Jon's final rejection of the political world that had demanded so much of him while offering so little in return for his sacrifices and service. The lands that stretched northward from the Great Barrier held dangers that were honest in their hostility, creatures and conditions that threatened death without the elaborate deceptions and moral compromises that characterized the Game of Thrones. The wilderness offered challenges that could be met with courage and skill, rather than the diplomatic maneuvering and careful calculation of competing interests that had made his time as king such a burden to his naturally straightforward nature. The great gate of Castle Black groaned open one final time for Jon Snow, its massive hinges singing a farewell song that seemed to echo with the voices of all the brave men who had passed through those portals on missions from which they never returned. The symbolism of his departure was not lost on anyone who witnessed it, as the man who had risen higher than any bastard before him chose exile and obscurity over the corrupted glory that southern ambitions inevitably produced. The closing of that gate behind him marked not merely the end of his involvement in the affairs of the Seven Kingdoms, but his transformation from political figure to something approaching legend, a story that would be told around fires for generations to come. The journey into the true north became a pilgrimage toward understanding and redemption, carrying Jon away from the world of men into landscapes that had remained unchanged since the dawn of creation. The ancient forests that covered much of the land beyond the Wall possessed a primeval beauty that spoke of times before human civilization had begun its long struggle to impose order upon the natural chaos of the world. Every step carried him further from the complexities of kingship and closer to the simple truths that had originally drawn him to the Night's Watch, reminders that the greatest honor lay in service to others rather than the accumulation of personal power or glory. The free folk who accompanied him on this final journey represented the best aspects of human nature, freed from the artificial constraints that civilization imposed in its attempt to create order and justice through law and custom. Their acceptance of him was based not upon his titles or achievements, but upon the character he had demonstrated through actions that spoke louder than any words or proclamations could ever have done. Among them, he found the sense of belonging that had eluded him throughout his time in the halls of power, recognition that worth was measured in courage and integrity rather than the accidents of birth or the favor of those who controlled the levers of political influence. The conversations around evening campfires revealed wisdom that no maester's education could have provided, insights into the nature of freedom and responsibility that came only through living according to principles rather than expedience. The wildlings spoke of the land beyond the Wall as something sacred rather than merely territory to be conquered or controlled, understanding that true strength came from harmony with natural forces rather than the domination of weaker peoples through superior organization or technology. Their stories of ancient heroes and legendary deeds provided perspective on his own struggles and failures, showing that even the greatest figures in their history had faced impossible choices between competing goods and conflicting loyalties. The seasons that followed brought a peace that Jon had never known during his years of service to causes that demanded everything while offering little in return, except the knowledge that duty had been fulfilled regardless of personal cost. The rhythm of life beyond the wall was dictated by natural cycles rather than the artificial urgencies created by human ambition and political necessity, allowing time for reflection and healing that the constant crises of his former life had never permitted. The simple tasks of survival in a harsh environment provided purpose without the moral complexity that had made leadership such a burden during his time as king. The wildlife that gradually returned to lands once devastated by supernatural winter offered signs of hope and renewal that paralleled the gradual healing of Jon's own wounded spirit, demonstrating that life possessed resilience that could overcome even the most devastating setbacks given sufficient time and patience. The return of birds to areas where silence had reigned for years provided daily reminders that death was not the final word in any story, that persistence and courage could ultimately triumph over the darkest forces that the world could conjure. The sight of new growth pushing through soil that had been frozen for generations spoke of possibilities for redemption that transcended individual guilt or failure. The legends that grew around Jon Snow in the years that followed his disappearance beyond the Wall transformed him from historical figure into something approaching mythical status, with stories that grew in the telling until they bore little resemblance to the complex realities of his actual life and choices. The bards sang of a bastard who became a king, who died and was reborn, who loved a queen and killed her to save the world from her madness. Yet these songs could never capture the quiet dignity with which he had chosen exile over power, or the simple satisfaction he found in serving others without expectation of recognition or reward. The truth of his story was both more mundane and more profound than any ballad could express, encompassing the painful growth that came from learning that heroism often required sacrificing everything that made life worth living. The free folk who shared his exile developed their own understanding of his significance that went beyond the political achievements that Southern historians would record for posterity, recognizing in him someone who had chosen freedom over comfort and service over glory. Their oral traditions preserved a different version of his story than the one told in the great halls of Westeros, emphasizing the qualities of character that made him worthy of following into the wilderness, rather than the titles and accomplishments that had briefly elevated him above his natural station. These stories spoke of someone who had found his true home among people who valued courage and loyalty over the artificial distinctions that divided the world south of the Wall. The passage of years brought changes that were measured not in political events or military campaigns, but in the gradual transformation of a man who had learned to find meaning in small acts of daily kindness rather than the grand gestures that had once seemed so important. The children born to the free folk during their resettlement looked to Jon as a figure of stability and wisdom, someone whose presence assured them that the future held promise, despite the hardships that survival in such harsh conditions inevitably entailed. His role as protector and guide required no formal authority or elaborate ceremony, deriving its legitimacy from demonstrated competence and unwavering commitment to the welfare of those who had chosen to follow him into exile. The northern lights that danced across the sky during the long winter nights provided a fitting backdrop for a life that had been shaped by forces beyond ordinary human understanding, their ethereal beauty serving as reminder that the world contained wonders that transcended the petty concerns of politics and power. The aurora's shifting patterns seemed to tell stories of their own, narratives of cosmic forces that made human struggles seem both insignificant and vitally important, depending upon the perspective from which they were viewed. Jon found comfort in watching these celestial displays, seeing in them evidence that beauty and meaning could exist even in the harshest environments when viewed with eyes trained to recognize truth rather than mere appearance. The peace that finally settled upon Jon Snow's spirit came not from forgetting the tragedies and failures that had marked his journey through the world of men, but from understanding that redemption lay in acceptance rather than the futile attempt to undo what could not be changed. The love he had felt for Daenerys Targaryen would always carry with it the bitter knowledge of what that love had cost the innocent people of King's Landing. Yet he had learned to honor both the genuine affection and the necessary sacrifice without allowing either to destroy his capacity for finding meaning in the present moment. The ghosts of the past would always walk beside him, but they no longer had the power to prevent him from embracing whatever happiness the future might offer. The final chapter of his story would be written not in the histories compiled by maesters, but in the lives of those he had chosen to protect and serve during his years of exile beyond the Wall, their children and grandchildren carrying forward lessons about honor and sacrifice that could never be captured in formal records. The bastard who had briefly worn a crown would be remembered not for the political achievements that had elevated him to power, but for the quiet dignity with which he had chosen to lay that power aside when its continued exercise would have compromised the principles that defined his character. In choosing exile over throne, service over dominion, and love over ambition, Jon Snow had written the final verses of a song that would echo through the ages as testimony to the truth that nobility of spirit transcended every accident of birth or circumstance.